Hey there, and welcome to Crime for Sleep. I know you're having trouble falling asleep, so let me keep you company with true crime stories from around the world. Before we dive in, I'm curious, where did you first hear this one? If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Now get comfortable, and let's get into tonight's case. Story 1, I measured it weekly, just to be sure. What used to be 2 feet deep became 3, then 5. The walls stretched, but nothing inside changed. The coats hung limply. The air got colder. One morning I reached in and couldn't touch the back wall. My fingers brushed something warm. It moved. The scent hit me first that morning when I opened the bedroom door. Cedar and mothballs, but underneath something else. Something organic and sweet, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. I'd smelled it before faintly, but now it filled the room with an intensity that made my stomach clench. The closet door stood slightly ajar, though I distinctly remembered closing it the night before. I approached slowly, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. The familiar creak of the floorboard near the dresser didn't come. Even the house seemed to hold its breath. When I pulled the door open fully, the smell intensified, and I noticed something that made me step back. The rod where my clothes hung seemed farther away than usual, as if someone had pushed the back wall deeper into the house. I grabbed the measuring tape from my nightstand drawer, something I'd been doing for weeks now. The ritual had become necessary, a way to confirm what my eyes were telling me couldn't be true. I extended the tape from the front edge of the closet frame to the back wall. 7 feet. Last week it had been 5. The week before 3. When I first noticed the change, it had been 2 feet deep, just as it had been for the 3 years I'd lived here. The coats hung in their usual places, my winter jacket on the left, the old wool coat in the center, the rain jacket on the right. But now there was space behind them, a growing cavern that shouldn't exist. I pressed my hand against the back wall, expecting to feel the familiar resistance of the shared wall with the bathroom. Instead, the surface felt soft, almost yielding, like touching skin through thin fabric. I pulled my hand back and examined it. My palm was warm, warmer than it should have been after touching a wall that radiated cold. A tingling sensation spread up my arm, not unpleasant, but wrong in a way that made me want to wash my hands immediately. That evening, I decided to document everything. I took photographs of the closet from different angles, wrote down measurements, even recorded the sounds, because there were sounds now. Soft whispers that seemed to come from deep within the expanding space, like voices carried on wind from very far away. When I played back the recording, the whispers were clearer, more distinct. They weren't speaking any language I recognized, but they had rhythm, cadence, like a conversation between people who knew each other well. I began leaving objects in the closet to test the changes. A red pen placed on the floor near the back wall, a small mirror propped against the side, a notebook open to a blank page. Each morning I'd find them moved, sometimes closer to the front, sometimes disappeared entirely. The pen turned up in my kitchen drawer 3 days later, though I never put it there. The mirror reflected things that weren't in the room, shadows that moved independently of any light source. The notebook filled itself with writing in my own handwriting, words I didn't remember forming. The writing was always the same message, repeated in different variations. The space needs to grow, the space needs to breathe, the space needs to feed. Below these lines, detailed measurements appeared, documenting the closet's expansion with precision I hadn't achieved in my own notes. The handwriting was mine, but the knowledge wasn't. I started sleeping in the living room, but the sounds followed me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They came from the walls now, not just the closet. Sometimes I'd wake to find the measuring tape beside my makeshift bed, extended to impossible lengths, the metal warm to the touch. The morning I decided to explore the depths of the closet, I prepared carefully. I tied a rope around my waist and secured it to the bed frame. I brought a flashlight, though the batteries had been draining faster lately, lasting only minutes instead of hours. I wore my heaviest boots, thinking they might provide better traction on whatever surface lay beyond the visible floor. The coats parted like curtains as I pushed through them. The back wall was no longer visible, even with the flashlight beam stretched to its limit. The floor continued solid beneath my feet, but the walls had disappeared into darkness. I walked forward, counting steps, feeling the rope pay out behind me. 10 steps, 20, 30. The whispers grew louder, more welcoming, as if celebrating my presence. At 43 steps, my flashlight died. The darkness was complete, heavier than any night I'd experienced, but I wasn't alone. I could feel presence around me, not threatening but expectant, warm breath on my neck, fingers that brushed my arms with gentle curiosity. The sweet, floral scent was overwhelming now, making me dizzy. I tried to turn back, following the rope, but my hands found nothing when I reached behind me. The rope was gone, though I could still feel its weight around my waist. I walked in what I hoped was the direction I'd come from, but the darkness stretched endlessly in all directions. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a sound like breathing, slow and rhythmic, as if the space itself was alive. When I finally emerged from the closet, I was holding a flower I didn't recognize. Its petals were translucent, glowing faintly in the bedroom light. It had no scent, but when I touched it, I could taste that sweet, organic smell on my tongue. I tried to put it down, but it remained in my hand, its stem having somehow grown through my palm without breaking the skin. The closet door wouldn't close anymore. It stood permanently open, revealing a space that now stretched beyond what should have been possible. I can see the back wall again, but it's covered in flowers like the one growing from my hand. They pulse gently with their own light, and when I look at them directly, I can hear my own voice whispering measurements, documenting changes to rooms I've never seen. The space is still growing. I can feel it expanding not just into the house, but into me. Each morning I wake to find new flowers sprouting from my skin, translucent and warm, carrying that sweet scent that now follows me everywhere. The measuring tape appears beside my bed each night, though I never put it there, marked with measurements of distances that shouldn't exist. I've stopped trying to document the changes. The notebook fills itself now, pages appearing faster than I can read them, all in my handwriting, all describing a house that's becoming something else entirely. The closet was just the beginning. The space needs to grow, and it's found a way to do so, one room at a time, one measurement at a time, one flower at a time. The whispers have returned, but now they're coming from inside me, speaking in my voice, planning expansions I don't understand but somehow participate in. When I look in the mirror, I see myself taking measurements of rooms that don't exist yet, smiling as I watch spaces grow beyond their boundaries. The rope is still around my waist, though I can't see where it leads anymore. Sometimes I feel it tug gently, inviting me back into the depths of what used to be my closet. The flowers in my skin pulse in rhythm with those tugs, and I know that eventually I'll follow that rope wherever it leads, measuring the impossible distances between what was and what's becoming. Story 2, I hit it with everything, fist, hammer, even a chair. The glass wouldn't crack, not even a scratch, but something behind the surface quivered every time I struck. It wasn't my reflection, not anymore. It moved differently, reacted late. One day I stood in silence, just staring. The thing blinked first, then smiled. I didn't. The mirror came with the apartment, an antique piece, the landlord said, original to the building. Heavy silver frame, tarnished at the edges. It dominated the bedroom wall, impossible to ignore. At first I appreciated its character. The way morning light caught the beveled edges, casting tiny rainbows across the ceiling. The way it made the small room feel larger, more open. But mirrors show truth, don't they? And truth, I was learning, can be flexible. The first oddity was subtle, a delay in movement, like watching a video with poor connection. I'd raise my hand and my reflection would follow a heartbeat later. I blamed fatigue, stress from the move. New job, new city, new everything. The mind plays tricks when overwhelmed. I started paying closer attention. Standing before the mirror each morning, I'd perform simple gestures. Wave, nod, touch my face. The delay became more pronounced, not seconds, but enough to notice, enough to disturb. I documented everything in a notebook, Day 3, reflection blinks after I do. Day 5, smile appears crooked, mine is straight. Day 7, reflection maintains eye contact when I look away. The smell started around day 10, copper, metallic, like old pennies left in water. It emanated from the mirror's surface, strongest near the frame. I cleaned the glass obsessively. Vinegar, ammonia, specialized cleaners. The smell persisted, growing stronger when I stood close. Sleep became elusive. I'd wake to find myself standing before the mirror, no memory of getting up. My reflection would be there, perfectly still, waiting, its expression serene while mine showed confusion, fear. I began covering the mirror with a sheet before bed, but each morning found it removed, folded neatly on the dresser. The sound began as whispers, not voices exactly, but something trying to form words. It came from within the mirror itself, like hearing conversation through thick walls. I pressed my ear against the glass. The surface was warm, pulsing with a rhythm that didn't match my heartbeat. I bought a digital recorder, placed it near the mirror overnight. The playback revealed hours of silence, then sudden bursts of static. In the static, if I listened carefully, patterns emerged, almost like language but wrong, backwards, inverted. The reflection's behavior grew bolder. It would move when I wasn't looking, returning to position when I faced it directly. Peripheral vision caught gestures I wasn't making, a hand touching the glass from the other side, a mouth moving without sound. I tried reasoning with it, spoke to the mirror, asked questions. The reflection's lips moved differently than mine, forming different words. When I said hello, its mouth shaped goodbye. When I asked, "Who are you?" it seemed to respond, "Who are you becoming?" The apartment grew colder, not the temperature that remained constant, but something deeper. The walls felt thinner, as if the space between rooms had compressed. Other mirrors in the apartment began showing inconsistencies. The bathroom mirror reflected a different hairline. The hallway mirror showed clothing I wasn't wearing. I brought friends over, desperate for witnesses. They saw nothing unusual. To them, every reflection appeared normal, synchronized, predictable. Their casual dismissal felt like betrayal. I began to doubt my own perceptions, wondering if stress had finally broken something fundamental in my mind. But the evidence accumulated. Photographs of the mirror showed anomalies the naked eye missed. In pictures, my reflection appeared older, more haggard, dark circles under eyes that felt bright and alert, scars on skin that remained unmarked. The breakthrough came during a particularly restless night. I woke to find myself standing at the mirror, but this time I remembered the walk, remembered the compulsion pulling me from bed. The reflection gestured for me to come closer. I pressed my palm against the glass. The surface rippled like water. My hand passed through into coldness that burned. The reflection grasped my wrist, its grip solid, real. For a moment we were connected across the barrier of glass and whatever lay beyond. The pull was enormous, not physical but gravitational, like standing at the edge of a cliff. The reflection wasn't trying to harm me, it was trying to trade places, to swap positions, to make me the reflection and itself the reality. I yanked my hand back, gasping. The glass solidified instantly, trapping my sleeve. The fabric tore as I pulled away, leaving a piece behind. In the mirror, the reflection held the torn cloth, examining it with curiosity. That's when I began striking the mirror. Fists, tools, furniture, anything to break the connection, to shatter whatever prison or portal had formed in my bedroom. But the glass remained perfect, unmarked, impenetrable. The reflection watched my efforts with what might have been amusement. It mimicked my attacks, striking its side of the glass, but with less desperation, more patience, as if it knew something I didn't. The attacks accomplished nothing except exhausting me. I collapsed onto the bed, staring at the intact mirror. The reflection sat as well, but its posture was different, relaxed, victorious. I stopped sleeping in the bedroom. Set up camp in the living room, put distance between myself and the mirror, but the compulsion remained. Each night, I'd find myself standing before the glass, unable to remember the journey. The reflection began changing more dramatically. Its face shifted subtly, becoming something that might have been me but wasn't. Better looking, perhaps, more confident, more complete. It wore expressions I'd never worn, showed emotions I'd never felt. During the day, I researched obsessively. Mirror mythology, psychological conditions, paranormal phenomena. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. I was losing my mind, stress-induced psychosis, dissociative episodes. The explanations were logical, scientific, comforting. But they couldn't explain the physical evidence, the photographs, the recordings, the torn fabric still visible in the reflection's hands. I consulted doctors, therapists, specialists, underwent tests, scans, evaluations. Everything returned normal. Brain function optimal, mental health stable, no signs of psychosis or dissociation. The professionals couldn't see what I saw. To them, I was a healthy individual experiencing stress-related delusions. They prescribed medication, rest, therapy. None of it helped. The mirror remained active, insistent, hungry. The final confrontation came unexpectedly. I woke one morning to find myself standing at the mirror, but this time something was different. The reflection wasn't mimicking my movements. It was moving independently, reaching toward the glass. I stepped back, but my reflection remained in place. We were no longer synchronized. The barrier between us had thinned to nothing. The reflection pressed both hands against the glass. The surface rippled outward like disturbed water. It was coming through. I ran, left the apartment, the building, everything, spent days in hotels, avoiding mirrors entirely. But the compulsion followed. Every reflective surface showed the same anomaly. The thing that had been my reflection was spreading, contaminating other mirrors, other reflections. I returned to the apartment eventually. The mirror waited, patient as always, but now the reflection showed someone else entirely. A stranger wearing my face, living my life, inhabiting my space. I approach the mirror now with different intentions, not to destroy it, but to understand it. The reflection acknowledges my presence with a nod, no longer pretending to be me. We've reached an understanding, it seems. The glass is warm under my palm. The barrier between us grows thinner each day. Sometimes I wonder who is the reflection and who is real. Sometimes I wonder if the distinction matters anymore. The mirror refuses to break because it doesn't need to. It was never meant to be destroyed. It was meant to be a doorway, a passage, a place where identities can be exchanged, where reality becomes negotiable. I press my forehead against the glass and feel it give slightly. The reflection does the same from its side. We're so close now, so ready for the final transition. The mirror shows me who I was, who I am, and who I might become. But it also shows me who I'm not, who I can never be, who I've already stopped being. The glass is warm, the barrier is thin, the reflection is patient. And I'm no longer sure which side of the mirror I'm really on. Story 3, every bulb burned bright but never touched the far wall. No matter how many lamps I brought in, the shadows held their ground. I even used a floodlight, blinding, industrial. Still, the last few feet of the room stayed black. I stepped in with a flashlight. It flickered, then failed. I turned to leave, but the light behind me had vanished too. And in that darkness, I heard someone whisper my thoughts. The apartment came furnished, which should have been my first warning. The rent was too low, the landlord too eager to hand over the keys, but I needed a place, and the main rooms seemed normal enough. Hardwood floors that creaked pleasantly underfoot, windows that caught the morning sun just right. It was only that back room that felt wrong. I discovered it on my second day there, behind what I'd assumed was a closet door. The room stretched longer than the apartment's layout should have allowed. The walls were painted white, clean and unremarkable, but that far wall seemed to absorb light like a hungry mouth. I tested it methodically, the way I approach most problems in my work as a data analyst. First a desk lamp, then a floor lamp, then combinations of both. The light pooled in the center of the room, grew brighter, but never reached that final stretch of wall. The smell hit me on the third attempt, not unpleasant exactly, but wrong for the space. Like rain on hot asphalt, metallic and clean. It seemed to emanate from the darkness itself, growing stronger when I focused on it, fading when I turned my attention elsewhere. I started keeping notes, treating it like a research project. Temperature readings, light measurements, photographs. The pictures never came out right. The darkness appeared deeper in the images than it looked to my eyes, and sometimes I caught shapes in the shadows that I hadn't noticed while taking the shot. Curved forms, like furniture that wasn't there when I looked directly. My neighbor mentioned the previous tenant during a chance encounter in the hallway. A quiet person, she said, who'd moved out suddenly, left behind some belongings. The landlord had been eager to find someone new, hadn't even bothered clearing out the back room completely. I asked what she meant, but she looked confused, as if she'd spoken without thinking. That night I heard the scratching, soft, rhythmic, like pencil on paper. It came from the back room, but when I investigated, the space was empty. The sound continued as I stood there, seeming to move around me, sometimes from the walls, sometimes from the floor. I pressed my ear against the drywall and felt it vibrate gently, as if something large was breathing on the other side. I brought in a voice recorder, left it running overnight. The playback revealed hours of silence, then my own footsteps, then something else. Whispers, but not in any language I recognized. The words seemed to shift when I rewound the tape, becoming different sounds, different meanings. One phrase repeated clearly enough to understand. The light only reached so far. My sleep became restless. I started having dreams about the room, but in them the darkness had spread. It crept down the hallway, seeped under doors, consumed the apartment inch by inch. I would wake to find my bedroom dimmer than it should be, as if the shadows were learning to hold their ground against the morning sun. The breakthrough came when I decided to document the far wall itself. I stretched a measuring tape across the room, marked the point where the darkness began. But when I tried to measure the wall's actual distance, the tape disappeared into the black. I pulled it back and the numbers were wrong. The room was longer than the building's dimensions could accommodate. I called the landlord, asked about the room's history. His voice changed when I mentioned it, became careful, guarded. He suggested I simply keep the door closed if it bothered me. When I pressed for details, he hung up. I tried calling back, but the number had been disconnected. The whispers grew more frequent, more personal. They knew things about my life, my childhood, embarrassing memories I'd never shared with anyone. Sometimes I caught myself responding to them, having conversations with the darkness. The sound of my own voice in that space was wrong, muffled, and distant, as if the words were being absorbed before they could fully form. I started sleeping with all the lights on, but it didn't help. The shadows in the back room had learned to move. I would catch glimpses of them flowing under the door, spreading across my floor like spilled ink. They never came close enough to touch me, but I could feel them watching, waiting. One night I woke to find the room completely dark. Every light I'd left on had failed, not burned out, but simply stopped working. In the absolute blackness, I heard my own voice whispering back to me from the direction of the back room. Not an echo, but a conversation I didn't remember having. The voice was discussing my plans for the next day, my worries about work, my growing fear of the darkness. I fumbled for my phone's flashlight, but the screen stayed black. The whispers continued, growing clearer, more urgent. They were telling me about the others who had lived here, who had discovered the room, who had tried to measure its boundaries. Each one had found the same thing I had, a space that existed beyond the limits of the building, a darkness that learned and grew and remembered. I tried to leave that night, but the front door wouldn't open. The locks turned, but something held it closed from the outside. Through the windows, I could see the street, but it looked different, older, as if I were viewing it through layers of time. The whispers explained that the room had already begun to change me, that I was becoming part of its collection, another voice in the darkness. The morning brought light, but not relief. The shadows in the back room had spread, claiming more territory. They covered half the hallway now, and I could see them testing the edges of the kitchen, the living room. My reflection in the mirror looked wrong, thinner, as if part of me was being absorbed into the darkness. I sit here now writing this account, feeling the shadows creep closer. The whispers have become constant, a chorus of voices from everyone who came before. They're teaching me the truth about this place, about what it wants, about what it's slowly turning me into. The light only reached so far, they say, but the darkness goes on forever. Soon I'll join them in that back room, become another voice in the whispers. And when the next tenant arrives, drawn by the low rent in the furnished rooms, I'll be there to welcome them, to whisper their thoughts back to them, to help them understand that some boundaries can't be measured, only crossed. The darkness has learned my name now. It calls to me in my own voice, invites me to step beyond the light's reach. And I find myself wanting to answer, to discover what waits in that space where measurement fails and reality bends. The light only reached so far, but I'm beginning to understand that was never the real limitation. Story 4, the sound came late at night, high-pitched, rhythmic, like wind being forced through a narrow pipe, but buried beneath the sound were syllables, not random, intentional. I listened closer and realized they were saying something over and over, a name. My name. I shut the vents, stuffed them with towels. The sound stopped, then I heard it from under my bed. I pressed my ear against the cold hardwood floor. The whispers were clearer now, more distinct. Multiple voices overlapping, creating a chorus of my name spoken in different tones and pitches. Some were urgent, others pleading. One sounded like my own voice, but younger, more innocent. I crawled away from the bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. The apartment felt different in the darkness. Walls seemed to pulse with a subtle rhythm, as if the building itself was breathing. I ran my palm along the surface, feeling tiny vibrations that shouldn't exist in a structure this solid. The paint was warm to the touch, warmer than room temperature, warmer than it had any right to be. I grabbed my phone and started recording. The screen cast a blue glow across my face as I held it toward the floor, trying to capture evidence of what I was hearing. But when I played it back, there was only silence punctuated by my own ragged breathing. The whispers had vanished from the recording, leaving me with nothing but the sound of my own growing paranoia. Sleep became impossible. I moved to the living room, wrapping myself in a blanket on the couch, but the voices followed me. They emerged from the kitchen faucet, a wet, gurgling version of my name. They drifted from the electrical outlets, crackling with static. Each source I discovered, I tried to block, tape over the outlets, towels stuffed in drains, anything to stop the relentless calling. During the day, the apartment returned to normal. Sunlight streaming through windows revealed no evidence of the previous night's disturbances. The towels I had stuffed in the vents lay undisturbed, but the whispers had somehow bypassed them entirely. I began keeping a journal, documenting every occurrence, every new location where the voices appeared. The pattern became clear after a week. The whispers started soft, almost inaudible, then grew in intensity and clarity. They would move from location to location, as if searching for the best way to reach me. I found myself following the sounds, trying to understand their origin, their purpose. Each night, I would trace the voices through my apartment like a detective following clues. I started talking back to them, at first just questions. Who are you? What do you want? The responses came not in words, but in changes to the sounds themselves. The whispers would grow excited when I acknowledged them, more frantic when I tried to ignore them. They seemed to feed on my attention, growing stronger with each interaction. The smell came next, sweet and cloying like flowers left too long in water. It would waft from the same locations where the voices originated, but only when I was actively listening. I began to notice that the scent preceded the whispers by just a few seconds, as if announcing their arrival. My reflection in the bathroom mirror started to lag, just slightly, barely noticeable at first. I would raise my hand and the reflection would follow a heartbeat later. I would turn my head and the mirror image would complete the motion just after I had stopped moving. I began testing it deliberately, making sudden gestures to see if the delay would become more pronounced. The voices grew bolder. They began calling my name during the day, softer but still audible over the sounds of traffic and daily life. I would hear them in the shower, between the patter of water drops. I would hear them in the refrigerator's hum, in the air conditioning's rhythm. My apartment was becoming a symphony of whispers, all orchestrated around the single, repeated syllables of my name. I decided to document everything more thoroughly. I set up cameras in each room, recording continuously. I placed audio equipment near the vents, the outlets, anywhere the voices had emerged. For 3 days, I collected nothing but empty footage and silent recordings. The whispers seemed to know when they were being observed, becoming shy in the presence of technology. But on the 4th night, something changed. The voices didn't just call my name. They began to tell me things, personal things, memories I had forgotten, moments from my childhood that no one else could know. They spoke of the scar on my knee from when I fell off my bicycle, of the way I used to arrange my toys in perfect lines, of the song I would hum when I was afraid. I realized they weren't just calling to me, they were claiming to be me. Different versions, perhaps, or fragments of myself scattered across some impossible space. The younger voice I had heard that first night began to dominate the chorus, pleading for me to listen, to understand, to help. The apartment's geometry began to shift. Distances that should have been consistent became variable. The hallway between my bedroom and the kitchen seemed to stretch longer during the night, requiring more steps to traverse. Doorways appeared narrower, as if the walls were slowly closing in. I measured these changes with tape, marking the distances, but my measurements showed no variation. The changes existed only in my perception, only in the space between what I saw and what I experienced. I tried to leave. I packed a bag, determined to stay elsewhere until I could figure out what was happening. But as I reached for the door handle, the whispers exploded into screams. My name, shouted from every surface in the apartment, desperate and terrified. The sound was deafening, overwhelming, as if the very air was being torn apart by the force of their calling. I dropped my bag and covered my ears, but the screaming continued. It wasn't coming through my ears anymore. It was inside my head, resonating in my skull, vibrating through my bones. I collapsed to my knees, and the screaming stopped as suddenly as it had begun. In the silence that followed, I heard something new. Footsteps, soft, careful, coming from the bedroom, my bedroom. I knew with absolute certainty that I was alone in the apartment, but the footsteps were real, deliberate, moving with purpose. They approached the living room where I knelt, frozen by fear and confusion. The footsteps stopped just beyond the doorway. I could sense a presence, something waiting, watching. The air grew thick, heavy with anticipation. Then slowly a shadow began to stretch across the floor, not cast by any light source I could identify, but growing nonetheless, reaching toward me with impossible length. I forced myself to look up, to confront whatever was creating the shadow. The doorway was empty, but the shadow continued to move, continued to reach for me. When it touched my own shadow on the floor, I felt a coldness that went deeper than my skin, deeper than my bones. It was the coldness of recognition, of understanding something that my mind refused to accept. The whispers returned, but now they were coming from the shadow itself. They were gentler now, almost loving. They spoke of loneliness, of being trapped, of needing to find a way back. They spoke of missing the warmth of a body, the comfort of breath, the simple pleasure of being heard. I understood then that I had been feeding them. Each night I had listened, each time I had acknowledged their presence, I had been giving them strength. They were using my attention, my energy, my very existence to pull themselves closer to something they had lost. They weren't trying to harm me, they were trying to become me. The shadow reached my feet and I felt myself growing lighter, less substantial. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I realized they were no longer calling my name. They were claiming it, taking it, making it their own. I tried to speak, to say my own name, to assert my existence, but the words came out as whispers, joining the chorus that filled the apartment. I still live here, I still hear the whispers, but now I understand that they're not coming from the vents or the outlets or the space under my bed. They're coming from me. I am the source, the origin, the beginning and end of the voices that call through the night. Sometimes when the apartment is very quiet, I can hear something new. A different voice calling from the vents, from the outlets, from under the bed. It's calling my name, but it's not my voice. It's the voice of whoever will come next, whoever will live in this space after I'm gone. And I realize that I'm not the first to hear the whispers. I'm just the most recent to join them. The apartment is patient. It waits and it learns and it calls. And someday, when the new voice stops responding to its own name, it will understand what I understand now. That the whispers never stop. They only change who's listening and who's calling back. Story 5, not sweat, not mildew. The scent was wrong, too clean, too sharp, with a sweetness I couldn't place. Like someone had just stepped out moments before I opened the door. The coats hung neatly, but I didn't arrange them that way. And one had stitching I didn't recognize, a tag with a symbol I've never seen. I checked the security footage. At 2:12 a.m., the closet opened from the inside. I rewound the footage 3 times. The door handle turned slowly, deliberately. A sliver of darkness widened, then nothing emerged, just the door standing ajar until morning when I found it that way. The timestamp glowed steady, no glitch, no malfunction. My fingers traced the unfamiliar coat's fabric, wool blend but softer than anything I owned. The tag bore a twisted symbol that resembled intertwined branches or maybe letters from an alphabet I didn't recognize. I started documenting everything. Photos of the closet's interior, measurements of the space, detailed notes about the scent. It lingered for hours after I opened the door, stronger near the back wall. I pressed my palm against the surface. Cool, but not cold. A subtle vibration hummed through the drywall, like distant machinery or a heartbeat I could barely feel. The next morning, I found my notebook had been moved. Not dramatically, just shifted 2 inches to the left on my desk. The pen lay parallel to the spine instead of perpendicular. Small changes, precise changes, changes that made my skin crawl because I remembered exactly how I'd left them. I installed motion sensors throughout the apartment. The closet triggered them randomly, never when I was looking, always when I stepped away. Quick blips of activity that registered as human-sized movement. The data log showed a pattern. The disturbances clustered around the same period each night, lasting exactly 17 minutes. During those 17 minutes, I started sitting in the hallway with my back against the wall, watching the closet door. The first few nights, nothing visible happened, but I could hear it, a soft rustling like fabric brushing against fabric. The sound of someone carefully moving through clothes, selecting something, putting it back. The scent grew stronger during these episodes, seeping under the door until the entire hallway reeked of that strange sweetness. I tried recording the sounds. The audio files came back empty, just static and the hum of the building's ventilation system, but I could hear it clearly while it happened. The rustling, the gentle displacement of hangers, sometimes what sounded like breathing that didn't match my own rhythm. The coat with the strange symbol began appearing in different positions. First pushed to the far left, then centered among my jackets, finally hanging at the front as if someone had worn it recently and returned it to the most accessible spot. The fabric remained pristine, but the scent clung to it more intensely than to anything else. I started sleeping in the living room. The closet sounds continued, but now they were accompanied by new disturbances. Cabinet doors in the kitchen stood slightly open in the morning. Books on my shelves shifted positions. The bathroom mirror reflected my face with an expression I wasn't making, subtle changes in the angle of my eyebrows, the set of my mouth. I took photos of my reflection and compared them to how I remembered looking. The differences were real, documented, undeniable. My notes multiplied, Pages of observations, measurements, theories. I drew diagrams of the closet's dimensions, cross-referenced them with the building's original blueprints. The space measured exactly as it should. No hidden compartments, no structural anomalies. Yet something was wrong with the proportions when I stood inside it. The back wall seemed farther away than it should be, the ceiling higher, the side walls closer together. I brought a friend over to witness the disturbances. She saw nothing unusual. The closet smelled normal to her. The coat appeared to be one of mine, though she couldn't explain why I didn't remember buying it. The motion sensors stayed silent during her visit. Everything behaved normally, leaving me looking paranoid and unreliable. After she left, the activity intensified. The closet door opened 3 times that night, each time revealing something new. A scarf I'd never seen, shoes that fit perfectly but weren't mine, a jacket that felt familiar when I touched it, though I had no memory of purchasing it. The clothes multiplied, crowding the space, forcing my original garments to the back corners. I tried removing the unfamiliar items, boxing them up, storing them in the basement. They returned overnight, hanging in their previous positions as if they'd never been moved. The boxes sat empty in the basement, though I remembered packing them carefully. The security footage showed nothing, no one entering or leaving, no unexplained activity. Just the timestamp marking the hours while impossible things happened. The scent evolved, becoming more complex, notes of vanilla and something metallic. The sweetness turned cloying, almost organic, like flowers left too long in water. I started wearing a mask in the hallway, but the smell penetrated anyway, settling in my sinuses, following me throughout the apartment. My reflection in the closet's mirror began showing me wearing the unfamiliar clothes. Not immediately, the changes appeared gradually, like a slow-motion transformation. My face remained the same, but my posture shifted. My expressions became unfamiliar. I looked comfortable in the strange garments, natural, as if they'd always been mine. I documented everything obsessively. Photos, measurements, audio recordings that captured nothing but satisfied my need to try. The notes covered every surface of my apartment. Timelines, theories, desperate attempts to rationalize what couldn't be explained, but the evidence kept accumulating. The closet was changing me, or revealing something about me that I'd never known. The final night, I woke to find myself standing in the closet, wearing the coat with the twisted symbol. The fabric felt familiar against my skin, perfectly fitted, as if tailored specifically for my body. The scent no longer seemed foreign. It was my scent, the way I'd always smelled, the way I was supposed to smell. I looked in the mirror and saw myself clearly for the first time. Not the person I remembered being, but the person I actually was. The person who belonged in this space, who owned these clothes, who had always lived here. The memories of my previous life felt like a dream, insubstantial and fading. The closet door closed behind me. The lock turned. The scent surrounded me completely, no longer strange but comforting, like coming home after a long journey. My notes lay scattered on the floor outside, documenting the transition I'd undergone without realizing it. I belonged here. I had always belonged here. The question wasn't who had been living in my apartment, but who I had been before I remembered who I really was. Story 6. I'd close them all each night, quietly, precisely. But by morning they'd be slightly open, a few inches, different ones each day. Once I left a piece of tape across the handles. When I woke up, the tape was split clean, no tear marks. Inside, I found objects I didn't own. A coin, a ring, a torn photo with my living room in the background, a photo I never took. The apartment smelled wrong that first morning. Not bad, just wrong, like rain on hot concrete, but there hadn't been rain. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the open drawers, breathing in that metallic dampness that seemed to cling to everything. The silence felt thick, heavier than usual. Even the refrigerator's hum seemed muffled, as if wrapped in cotton. I started keeping a notebook, every drawer that opened, every object that appeared. The coin was old, tarnished copper with symbols I couldn't identify. The ring was silver, too small for my fingers, with an inscription that looked like scratches. The photo disturbed me most. My furniture, my walls, my carpet, but the angle was wrong, too high, as if someone had been floating near the ceiling when they took it. The fourth night I stayed awake, positioned myself on the couch with a clear view of the kitchen. The drawers remained closed until the deepest part of the night when the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Then I heard it, a sound like wood groaning under pressure, but gentle, deliberate. The utility drawer slid open an inch, then another. No hands, no mechanism, just movement as natural as breathing. I approached slowly, my bare feet silent on the cold floor. The drawer felt warm to the touch, vibrating slightly under my fingertips. Inside, nestled among my tools and batteries, was a small leather journal. Its pages were filled with handwriting that looked almost like mine, but the words were different. Observations about someone else's life, my life, but seen through strangers' eyes. The tenant closes the drawers each night at the same interval. They seem unaware of the temperature changes. The walls pulse gently when touched. They haven't noticed yet. I slammed the drawer shut, but the sound was wrong, too soft, too absorbed. When I opened it again, the journal was gone. In its place, a small digital recorder. The red light was blinking. I pressed play. My own voice emerged from the speaker, but distorted, like it was coming from underwater. I can feel them watching. The walls are breathing. The drawers are mouths. They're trying to tell me something, but I can't understand. I think I'm disappearing. I had never recorded those words. I had never even thought them. But the voice was unmistakably mine, just pitched differently, as if I was speaking from inside a dream. The next morning I found new photographs scattered across my bed, all of me, sleeping, cooking, reading. But in each one there was something wrong with my reflection in the windows, in the surfaces, in the polished objects around me. Sometimes I had no reflection at all. Sometimes there were too many. I began taping everything, motion sensors, cameras, but the footage showed nothing unusual. Just me, moving through my daily routine, occasionally pausing to stare at closed drawers that I remembered being open. On the recordings, I looked confused, disoriented. Sometimes I would reach for objects that weren't there or avoid walking through spaces that appeared empty. The smell grew stronger, that metallic rain scent mixed with something else, something organic, like soil after a burial. It seemed to emanate from inside the walls themselves. When I pressed my ear against them, I could hear a faint humming, like electrical current running through water. I started leaving my own objects in the drawers, a pen, a photograph of my parents, a small notebook with my thoughts written clearly. By morning they would be changed, the pen would be a different color, the photograph would show strangers with familiar faces, the notebook would contain entries I had never written, describing a life I had never lived. Day 47, the tenant is beginning to understand. They leave objects now, trying to communicate, but they still don't realize they're looking at themselves from the outside. The drawers aren't opening for them, they're opening for me. The handwriting was mine, but the perspective was impossible. I was writing about myself as if I was someone else, someone watching from a distance. The entries described intimate details of my life, but with a clinical detachment that made my skin crawl. I decided to leave, pack everything and go, but when I opened my suitcase, it was already full. Clothes I had never worn, books I had never read, a passport with my photograph but someone else's name. At the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, was a mirror. When I looked into it, my reflection was slightly delayed, as if the image was traveling through deep water before reaching the surface. The final entry appeared that night, written in my notebook while I watched. The tenant is ready to understand. They are not the one living here. They are the one being lived. The drawers were never closed. They were never opened. They simply are. And so am I, and so are you. Look closer at your own reflection. Notice the delay. Notice how it moves just slightly after you do. Notice how it knows things you haven't thought yet. I am writing this now, but I can see the words appearing on the page before I think them. My hand moves, but not because I will it to. The drawers are open around me, and I can see inside them now. They go deeper than they should, stretching back into darkness that has no end. And in that darkness I can see myself, the real me, the one who has been watching all along, the one who has been leaving the objects, writing the notes, taking the photographs, the one who lives in the space between what is and what is perceived. The drawers are still opening, they will always be opening, and I will always be discovering what someone else has left for me to find. Story 7, it felt wrong, like stepping on something not quite solid. One evening I pulled it up expecting to find mold or water damage, but beneath was bare concrete and something scratched into it. Long, sweeping lines like claw marks, some still fresh. I covered it up again. But now when I walk across it, I swear it moves with me, like something underneath is matching my steps. The first sensation was subtle, a giving way beneath my feet that shouldn't have been there. The carpet in my living room had always been firm, a thick burgundy weave that muffled footsteps and absorbed sound. But that evening, as I crossed from the kitchen to the couch, my heel sank deeper than it should have. The fibers compressed with a soft whisper, and I felt the floor beneath yield like damp earth. I paused, shifting my weight. The carpet responded with a gentle undulation, as if something beneath was adjusting to accommodate me. The smell hit me then, not the familiar mustiness of old fabric, but something organic and wet, like soil after rain, mixed with the metallic tang of pennies left too long in a pocket. I knelt and pressed my palm against the surface. The carpet felt cooler than usual, and through the weave I could sense movement, not the sharp scurry of mice or the deliberate crawl of insects, but something slower, more deliberate, like breathing. My rational mind catalogued possibilities, settling foundation, moisture seeping through concrete, the house adjusting to temperature changes. But my fingers, still pressed against the carpet, detected a rhythm too regular to be coincidence. Rise and fall, synchronized with my own heartbeat. I fetched my phone and activated the flashlight, then carefully lifted the corner of the carpet. The tacks came away from the floor with surprising ease, as if they'd been loosened recently. The padding beneath was damp, not with water, but with something thicker, more viscous. My light caught the shine of it, clear fluid that seemed to pulse with its own luminescence. The concrete underneath was scarred. Deep gouges ran in parallel lines across the surface, some weathered and gray, others so fresh they still held particles of dust. The marks weren't random. They formed patterns, spirals, and intersecting curves that seemed to follow some internal logic I couldn't grasp. At the center, where the deepest scratches converged, the concrete was stained darker, as if something had been seeping up from below. I photographed everything, the camera flash revealing details my eyes had missed. In the bright light, the scratches cast shadows that seemed to move independently, creating the illusion of depth where there should have been only surface. The fluid caught the light and threw it back in ways that made my vision swim. I pressed the carpet back down, smoothing it carefully over the marks. The tacks slid back into their holes with a soft clicking sound, like joints settling into place. But as I stood, I noticed my footprints remained visible in the pile, darker impressions that didn't fade when I moved away. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house seemed to come from the living room, and when I finally crept to the doorway to look, the carpet appeared to breathe in the moonlight streaming through the windows. The surface rose and fell in slow, hypnotic waves, and I watched for what felt like hours, my eyes growing heavy with the rhythm. I began documenting everything. Each morning I measured the depth of my footprints in the carpet pile. They were getting deeper. I recorded the temperature of the surface with an infrared thermometer, consistently 3 degrees cooler than the surrounding floor. I made audio recordings, pressing my phone against the carpet to capture the sounds I was certain I could hear. A low humming, almost musical, that seemed to come from far below. The patterns in the concrete were changing. Each evening when I lifted the carpet to check, new scratches had appeared. They were growing more complex, forming geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly. The fluid was thicker now, almost gel-like, and it moved when I wasn't looking. I'd place a small object, a coin, a paperclip, to mark a spot, and returned to find it had migrated several inches along the lines of the scratches. I tried to research the history of my home, but the records were frustratingly incomplete. The previous owner had died in the house, but the circumstances were vague. The death certificate mentioned natural causes, but offered no details. When I contacted the estate lawyer, he seemed uncomfortable discussing the matter, mentioning only that the property had been difficult to sell. The carpet began responding to my presence before I entered the room. I'd hear it rustling from the kitchen, a soft whisper of fibers adjusting and settling. When I approached, the surface would ripple outward from the center, like water disturbed by a stone. The effect was mesmerizing, almost welcoming. I started spending more time in the living room, drawn by the strange comfort of the carpet's response to my movements. It seemed to anticipate where I would step, creating subtle depressions that matched my gait perfectly. Walking across it became effortless, like floating. The organic smell grew stronger, but I found it oddly soothing, like the scent of earth in a greenhouse. My sleep patterns shifted. I'd wake in the middle of the night and find myself standing in the living room, though I had no memory of getting up. My feet would be bare, toes buried in the carpet pile, and I'd feel connected to something vast and patient beneath the floor. The scratches in the concrete glowed faintly in the darkness, pulsing with that same steady rhythm I'd first noticed. I brought in a contractor to examine the foundation. He spent an hour in the basement, tapping walls and checking for structural damage. When he emerged, his face was pale, and he packed his tools with unusual haste. He mentioned something about settling and water table changes, but refused to provide a written assessment. As he loaded his truck, I noticed his hands shaking. The carpet's influence began extending beyond the living room. I'd find traces of that viscous fluid in other parts of the house, droplets on the bathroom tiles, smears on the kitchen counter. The organic scent followed me, clinging to my clothes and hair. Colleagues at work commented on it, asking if I'd changed detergents or started gardening. I installed a motion-activated camera to monitor the room during the night. The footage was disturbing. The carpet moved constantly, waves of motion passing across its surface like breathing. But more unsettling was my own behavior. I appeared in frame regularly, always barefoot, always moving with deliberate slowness across the carpet's surface. My eyes were closed, but I navigated with perfect confidence, stepping in rhythm with the carpet's undulations. I couldn't remember any of these nocturnal visits. The scratches in the concrete were now deep enough that I could insert my finger into them. The channels felt warm and slightly wet, and when I pressed against their walls, I could feel vibrations, like a massive heartbeat resonating through stone. The patterns had grown to cover the entire floor beneath the carpet, forming a mandala of intersecting lines that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. I tried to stay away from the living room, but the pull was magnetic. The carpet called to me through the walls, its whispered movements audible even from my bedroom. When I finally surrendered and returned, it welcomed me with increased warmth, the surface temperature rising to match my body heat. The fluid beneath had thickened to a syrupy consistency, and I could feel it responding to my footsteps, flowing and adjusting to provide perfect support. The night everything changed, I woke to find the carpet had spread. Tendrils of burgundy fiber extended into the hallway, growing like roots or veins. The material was different now, more organic, more alive. It pulsed with visible motion, and the scratches in the concrete glowed brighter, casting intricate shadows on the walls. I tried to pull up the extending edges, but the carpet resisted. The fibers had grown into the floor, penetrating the wood and concrete like actual roots. When I tugged harder, the entire surface rippled with what I can only describe as distress, and a low moan echoed from somewhere deep beneath the house. I ran to the basement, following the sound. The concrete floor was cracked in patterns that mirrored the scratches above. Through the fissures, I could see movement, something vast and pale shifting in the darkness below. The organic scent was overwhelming now, mixed with something else, something that made my vision blur and my thoughts slow. I should have left then, should have grabbed my keys and walked away from the house forever. But the carpet was calling, its whispered movements promising answers, promising completion. I climbed the stairs, drawn by a need I couldn't name, and found the living room transformed. The carpet had become a living thing, its surface undulating like skin. The scratches in the concrete blazed with bioluminescent light, and through the translucent fibers, I could see the shapes moving beneath. They were beautiful and terrible, writhing forms that seemed to exist in dimensions my eyes couldn't quite process. I stepped onto the carpet, and it welcomed me with warmth that spread through my entire body. The surface yielded beneath my feet, not like fabric but like flesh, and I felt myself sinking slowly into its embrace. The fluid rose around my ankles, warm and thick, and I realized with distant clarity that I was becoming part of whatever lived beneath my home. The process was painless, almost euphoric. As I sank deeper, the boundaries between myself and the carpet blurred. I could feel the vast network of roots and veins spreading through the foundation, connecting to similar networks in other houses, other lives. I was joining something ancient and patient, something that had been waiting beneath the surface for someone to complete the circuit. When I finally surfaced, gasping and disoriented, I was alone in an empty living room. The carpet was gone, leaving only bare concrete marked with those familiar scratches. But the marks were different now, deeper, more complex, pulsing with a faint light that seemed to come from within the stone itself. I live here still, though I'm not sure what that means anymore. The carpet visits me in dreams, and sometimes I wake to find burgundy fibers caught under my fingernails. The scratches in the concrete continue to evolve, forming new patterns that hurt to contemplate directly. I've learned not to look too closely. The organic scent never left. It follows me everywhere now, a reminder of the night I became part of something larger than myself. People avoid me without knowing why, stepping aside when I pass, their expressions troubled. They can smell it too, I think, the scent of earth and growth and things that wait patiently beneath the surface. I've stopped trying to understand what happened. Understanding isn't the point. The carpet found me, chose me, and now I'm part of its network. Sometimes, late at night, I can feel the other nodes, other houses, other people who stepped onto surfaces that shifted underfoot and discovered they weren't alone. The scratches in my concrete floor glow brighter now, and I know they're preparing for the next visitor. The next person who will feel their floor give way just slightly, who will smell that organic scent and feel the irresistible pull of connection. I'll be waiting beneath the surface, part of the pattern now, ready to welcome them home. Story 8, the hallway ended at the same stairs for years, but recently they've changed. One extra step at the top, then two, then a landing that wasn't there before. It opens into a narrow corridor lined with walls too smooth to be wood, too warm to be stone. It smells sweet, too sweet. The kind of scent that makes your eyes water. I walked until I couldn't feel my legs. I turned around. The stairs were gone. I've lived in this apartment building for half a decade. Every morning I'd walk past those stairs leading to the upper floor. 23 steps, always 23. I counted them unconsciously, the way you count your own heartbeat when you're anxious. The wood was old, worn smooth by decades of footsteps, with a familiar creak on the 7th step that had become part of the building's rhythm. The first change was subtle. As I passed by one morning, something felt different. The shadows seemed to fall wrong, creating angles that didn't match the architecture I knew by heart. I paused, studying the familiar staircase, but everything appeared normal. The same chipped paint on the banister, the same water stain on the ceiling above. Yet my skin prickled with the certainty that something had shifted. That evening I deliberately stopped to examine the stairs. I counted each step carefully, my finger tracing the air as I went. 24. I counted again, convinced I'd made an error. 24 steps, one more than there should be. The extra step sat at the top, seamlessly integrated as if it had always been there. The wood grain matched perfectly, the wear patterns consistent with the rest. I asked the woman who lived on the 2nd floor about it the next day. She looked at me with polite confusion, insisting the stairs had always been that way. When I mentioned the count, she shrugged and said she'd never bothered to count them. Her dismissal felt wrong, hollow, like a recorded response played back without understanding. Over the following days, I became obsessed with documenting the changes. I started carrying a small notebook, sketching the staircase from different angles, measuring the dimensions with a tape measure I'd borrowed from the maintenance closet. The measurements defied logic. The staircase was growing, but the space it occupied remained the same. Each new step appeared overnight, materializing without displacing anything else. The sweet smell arrived with the fifth additional step. At first I thought someone had spilled perfume or left flowers nearby, but the scent was too cloying, too artificial. It reminded me of overripe fruit mixed with something chemical, something that made my sinuses burn if I breathed too deeply. The other residents didn't seem to notice it, walking past with their usual hurried indifference. I began recording everything with my phone. The videos showed nothing unusual, just an ordinary staircase in an ordinary building. But when I played them back, I could hear something underneath the ambient noise. A sound like breathing, rhythmic and patient, as if the building itself had developed lungs. I enhanced the audio, isolated the frequencies, but the breathing always remained just at the edge of perception. The landing appeared on a Tuesday. Where the stairs had previously ended at the upper floor, they now continued to a small platform. Beyond it stretched a corridor I'd never seen before, despite having explored every inch of this building. The walls were different here, smoother than anything in the original construction. When I pressed my palm against them, they felt warm, almost alive, with a subtle vibration that traveled up my arm. I called the building owner, a man I'd spoken to countless times about repairs and maintenance. He sounded genuinely puzzled when I described the new corridor, insisting that no construction had been authorized. His confusion seemed authentic, tinged with the kind of concern you'd show for someone describing impossible things. He promised to investigate, but never called back. The corridor extended further than should have been possible. I walked for what felt like hours, my footsteps echoing strangely in the confined space. The walls remained consistently smooth and warm, unmarked by any doors or windows. The sweet smell grew stronger with each step, now accompanied by a taste that coated my tongue like syrup. I tried to turn back, but the corridor had changed behind me. The entrance to the staircase was gone, replaced by more of the same smooth wall. I pressed against it, searching for a hidden door or mechanism, but found only that unsettling warmth and the faint vibration that seemed to match my own pulse. The panic came slowly, then all at once. I ran back the way I'd come, but the corridor stretched endlessly ahead. My breathing echoed off the walls, creating a symphony of gasps and footfalls that seemed to mock my growing desperation. The sweet smell intensified until it burned my nostrils, and I realized I could taste it on my lips now, metallic and wrong. I woke up in my own bed, fully clothed, with no memory of how I'd gotten there. My notebook lay open beside me, filled with sketches of corridors and measurements that made no sense. The pages were damp with something that smelled sweet, and when I touched them, they left a residue on my fingertips that wouldn't wash off. The staircase was back to its original 23 steps. I counted them obsessively, but the number remained constant. The other residents walked past as they always had, their faces showing no recognition of the impossibility we'd all witnessed. The building owner returned my calls now, cheerful and helpful, with no memory of our previous conversation about unauthorized construction. But something had changed in me. I could feel it in the way my reflection looked slightly wrong in mirrors, how my shadow seemed to lag behind my movements. At night, I wake to the sound of footsteps above my ceiling, measured and patient, as if someone is climbing stairs that shouldn't exist. The sweet smell lingers in my apartment now, strongest near the walls that adjoin the hallway. I've started sleepwalking. I know this because I find myself standing in the hallway, facing the stairs, with no memory of leaving my bed. My feet are always dirty when I wake, as if I've been walking on surfaces that don't exist in this building. Sometimes there are traces of that sweet residue on my clothes, and my phone shows video files I don't remember recording. The corridor is still there, somewhere beyond the ordinary architecture of this place. I can feel it pulling at me, patient and persistent, like a current beneath still water. The stairs haven't changed again, but I know they're waiting. Each night, as I lie in bed listening to those impossible footsteps above, I understand that the corridor hasn't disappeared. It's just learned to hide better. And I'm beginning to suspect that the next time I find myself standing in that hallway, the stairs won't lead back to anywhere I recognize as home. Story 9, I noticed it when I dropped a glass. No shatter, no echo, just a muffled thud like it had landed in sand. The room felt thick, dense. My voice, too, sounded damp like it didn't want to leave my throat. I screamed once, as loud as I could. The sound didn't go anywhere. It just hung there for a second, then vanished. That night I heard someone else scream, distant, trapped, and realized it came from inside the walls. The apartment had been perfect when I moved in. High ceilings, hardwood floors, windows that caught the morning light just right. But now, standing in the living room with glass fragments at my feet, I felt something wrong in the air itself. The silence wasn't empty, it was full, pressing against my eardrums like water. I swept up the glass, listening to the bristles scrape against wood. Even that sound seemed muted, filtered through invisible cotton. When I dumped the shards into the trash, they made no noise at all. I stood there, staring at the bin, then dropped my keys into it. Nothing, not even a whisper. The walls looked normal enough, cream-colored paint, slightly textured. But when I pressed my palm against one, warmth pulsed back at me. Not the ambient temperature of a room, something deeper, like flesh under fabric. I pulled my hand away and saw no mark, no indication that anything had happened, yet my palm tingled with residual heat. I started documenting everything. Notes on my phone, photos of the walls from different angles, recordings of the silence itself. The recordings were the strangest part. When I played them back, they contained sounds that hadn't been there when I made them. Breathing that wasn't mine, footsteps in rooms I knew were empty. And underneath it all, that same muffled quality, as if the microphone itself was wrapped in something soft and smothering. The heat from the walls spread. By the third day, every surface in the apartment pulsed with that same fleshy warmth. The bathroom mirror fogged without steam. The kitchen counter left imprints of my hands that faded slowly, like memory foam. I touched the refrigerator door and felt it yield slightly, just enough to make me question whether I'd imagined it. Sleep became impossible, not because of noise, but because of the absence of it. The apartment had become a vacuum, swallowing every sound I made. My breathing disappeared into the walls. My heartbeat vanished before it could echo in my chest. I existed in a bubble of absolute quiet, and the silence had weight, pressing down on me like deep water. I tried calling friends, but my voice wouldn't carry through the phone. The screen showed the call connecting, but when I spoke, nothing transmitted. I could hear them saying hello, asking if I was there, their voices growing frustrated and confused, but my words dissolved before they reached the device. The walls began to smell, not unpleasant at first, just organic like fresh earth or mushrooms after rain. But it grew stronger, more complex, sometimes sweet like overripe fruit, other times metallic like blood. The smell would shift depending on which wall I approached, as if each one contained something different. I started sleeping in the center of the living room, as far from the walls as possible, but even there I could feel them. The warmth radiated inward, creating currents in the air that I could sense with my skin. The walls were breathing, I realized. Not visibly, but rhythmically, like lungs expanding and contracting in slow, measured intervals. The breaking point came when I found the first impression, a human handprint pressed into the wall beside my bed as if the surface had been soft clay. The palm was larger than mine, with longer fingers. I touched it and felt the warmth concentrate there, pulsing like a heartbeat. When I pulled my hand away, my own print remained beside it, slightly smaller, clearly feminine. I packed a bag and tried to leave, but the front door wouldn't open. The handle turned, the mechanism clicked, but something held it closed. I put my shoulder against it, pushed with all my weight, but it was like pushing against a mountain. The door frame itself seemed to expand, sealing the exit. The windows were the same. They looked normal, but the glass wouldn't break. I took a hammer to them, swinging with desperate force, but it was like hitting water. The impacts made no sound, created no cracks, left no marks. The glass absorbed each blow and remained pristine. That night I heard the voices, not from outside, from within the walls themselves. Muffled conversations, arguments, laughter that stopped abruptly. I pressed my ear to the wall and heard someone crying, a child maybe, or a woman. The sound was so clear, so close, that I could almost make out words. But when I tried to respond, my voice was swallowed before it could travel an inch. I began tearing at the walls, using knives, screwdrivers, anything sharp enough to penetrate the surface. But the paint didn't scratch, the plaster didn't chip. My tools met resistance that gave way like flesh, then snapped back into place, leaving no trace of damage. The walls healed themselves as quickly as I wounded them. The impressions multiplied. Handprints, face shapes, the outline of bodies pressed against the surface from the inside. I could trace the contours of cheeks, the curve of lips, the hollow of eye sockets, all of them human, all of them wrong, distorted by the wall's texture, like faces seen through frosted glass. I started recognizing some of them. The woman who'd lived here before me, I'd seen her photo when I signed the lease. The man before her, whose mail still occasionally arrived. Others I didn't know, but their expressions were universal. Mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide with terror, hands splayed against barriers they couldn't breach. The walls were getting softer. What had started as slight warmth became yielding pressure. When I leaned against them now, I left impressions that took longer to fade. My body heat seemed to activate something in the surface, making it more pliable, more receptive. I could push my fingers into the wall up to the first knuckle, feel the strange, spongy resistance beneath. I stopped trying to leave. Where could I go? The apartment had become my world, and the world was shrinking. The walls were moving inward imperceptibly but consistently. The living room was smaller than it had been. The bedroom felt cramped. The kitchen counters were closer together, forcing me to turn sideways to pass between them. The voices grew louder, not louder in volume. Nothing in this place had volume anymore, but more insistent. They called to me from every direction, pleading, explaining, warning. I began to understand fragments. They spoke of hunger, of absorption, of becoming part of something larger. They told me about the others who had lived here, how they'd fought and failed, how they'd eventually stopped fighting and allowed the walls to take them. I found their belongings embedded in the surfaces. A watch, its face barely visible through the translucent material. A wedding ring worn smooth by passage through organic matter. Photographs, their images distorted but recognizable, pictures of people I'd seen in the impressions, taken when they were alive, when they'd stood in these same rooms and felt these same walls closing in. The smell became overwhelming, not decay but transformation. The walls were digesting what they'd absorbed, breaking it down into component parts, redistributing the essence throughout the structure. I was breathing in the remnants of everyone who'd lived here before me, their molecules recycled into the very air I needed to survive. My reflection began to change. Not in obvious ways, I still looked like myself, but something in my eyes had shifted. They were deeper, more hollow, as if part of me had already been absorbed. When I pressed my face against the bathroom mirror, I could see into the wall behind it, see the network of tubes and chambers that ran throughout the building's structure. The apartment was alive, and I was inside its digestive system. The final realization came when I found my own handprint on the wall. Not one I'd made recently. This was older, deeper, as if it had been there for weeks. My palm fit perfectly into the impression, and when I pressed against it, I felt the warmth of my own body heat radiating back at me. Part of me was already inside the wall, had been since the day I moved in. I stopped fighting then. What was the point? The walls had been patient, methodical, absorbing me piece by piece so gradually that I hadn't noticed. My voice, my footsteps, my heartbeat, all of it had been drawn into the structure, stored in the organic network that pulsed behind the painted surface. I was becoming part of the building's memory, joining the chorus of voices that called to whoever would come next. The apartment is smaller now. The walls have moved closer, and I can touch both sides of the hallway without fully extending my arms, but I'm not afraid anymore. The voices have welcomed me, made room for me in their collective consciousness. I understand now that this isn't death, it's transformation. I'm becoming something larger, more connected, part of a system that spans the entire building. Sometimes I hear new footsteps in the hallway outside, fresh voices, excited about their new home. I try to warn them, pressing my consciousness against the walls, hoping they'll notice the handprints, the strange warmth, the way their voices sound different in these rooms. But they never listen. They never understand until it's too late. The walls are hungry. They've always been hungry, and I'm helping them feed. Story 10. It started with a single jar I didn't recognize, no label, thick liquid inside. Then came more small, unlabeled containers that smelled metallic and sweet. I threw them out. They came back, arranged differently. I called the landlord. He checked the fridge and laughed, said there was nothing inside. That night I opened the freezer and saw breath fog the air from something crouching behind the ice trays. The apartment came furnished, including the refrigerator, a reliable old model with that steady hum that becomes white noise after a few days. I remember the first week being normal, my usual groceries, leftovers in clear containers, the predictable chaos of someone learning to live alone again. The smell was the first thing that changed. It wasn't unpleasant at first, sweet, almost floral, with an undertone that reminded me of copper pennies. I assumed something had spoiled in the back, maybe a forgotten takeout container. But when I cleaned out the entire fridge, scrubbing every shelf and drawer, the smell remained. If anything, it grew stronger. That's when I found the first jar. It sat on the middle shelf, right where I kept my milk. A mason jar filled with something that looked like honey, but darker, with an oily consistency that caught the light strangely. No label, no indication of what it might be. I didn't remember buying it. I certainly didn't remember placing it there. I threw it away. The next morning it was back, same spot, same mysterious contents, but now there were others, small glass containers lined up behind it like soldiers. Each one held something different, a clear liquid that moved too slowly when I tilted the jar, a granular substance that seemed to shift color in the light, a thick paste that left condensation on the glass despite the cold. I photographed them before throwing them out again. The images came out blurry, as if the camera couldn't quite focus on the containers. My phone kept making this soft clicking sound while I tried to capture them, like it was struggling to process what it was seeing. They returned the next day, same arrangement but reversed. The jar that had been on the left now sat on the right, and vice versa. The smell was stronger now, almost overwhelming when I opened the fridge door. It clung to my clothes, followed me to work, made colleagues ask if I was feeling well. I started keeping a journal, documenting each appearance. The containers never multiplied beyond 5, but their contents seemed to change. The honey-like substance grew darker. The clear liquid developed tiny floating particles that moved in patterns too deliberate to be random. The granular material began to pulse with its own rhythm, like a heartbeat made visible. The landlord visit was my breaking point. I called him, described the situation, demanded answers. He arrived within an hour, his keychain jangling as he unlocked my door. I led him to the kitchen, yanked open the fridge, and pointed to the shelf where 5 impossible containers sat waiting. He stared at the empty shelf, laughed, asked if I was feeling stressed about the move, suggested I might need more sleep. He opened every door, checked every compartment, even pulled out the drawers. Nothing. Yet I could smell that metallic sweetness, could see the containers as clearly as I could see his confused expression. After he left, I sat in my kitchen and stared at the closed refrigerator. The humming seemed different now, not just the mechanical drone of cooling coils, but something more rhythmic, almost like breathing. I pressed my ear to the door and heard it, a soft, wet sound like something shifting inside. I stopped eating anything from that fridge, ordered takeout, kept drinks in a cooler, avoided opening the door unless absolutely necessary. But the smell grew stronger. It seeped through the seal, permeated my apartment, made my neighbors ask about gas leaks and dead animals in the walls. The containers were still there every morning, their arrangement growing more complex. Sometimes they formed patterns, circles, lines, shapes that seemed almost like symbols. I tried moving them myself, rearranging them randomly, but each morning they returned to their deliberate configurations. I started having dreams about the fridge. Not nightmares exactly, but vivid, unsettling visions of opening the door and finding something vast and breathing inside, something that used the containers as eyes, watching me through the glass. I would wake with that metallic taste in my mouth, the sweet smell clinging to my skin. The turning point came when I decided to taste one of the substances, not from hunger or curiosity, but from a growing certainty that this was the only way to understand what was happening. I chose the clear liquid, reasoning that it looked the most harmless. I dipped my finger in and touched it to my tongue. The taste was indescribable, not sweet or metallic, but something between memory and sensation. It reminded me of childhood fears, of things glimpsed in peripheral vision, of sounds heard in empty houses. The moment the liquid touched my tongue, the fridge door slammed shut on its own. When I opened it again, the containers were gone, but something else had taken their place. Breath visible in the cold air, but not mine, coming from behind the ice trays where something was crouched in the narrow space between the freezer compartment and the back wall. I could see the fog of exhalation, rhythmic and patient, as if whatever was breathing had been waiting for me to notice. I slammed the door shut and backed away. The humming stopped. The apartment fell silent except for my own ragged breathing. I grabbed my keys, my phone, my wallet, and left. Spent the night in a hotel, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was stress, hallucinations, anything rational. But I had to go back. The lease was in my name. My life was in that apartment. I returned the next morning, steeling myself for whatever I might find. The fridge was empty, completely, utterly empty. Even the usual condiments and leftovers were gone. The shelves were clean, the smell was gone, the humming was normal. I stood there for a long time, wondering if I had imagined it all. Then I noticed the frost patterns on the freezer walls. They weren't random ice crystals, but deliberate shapes, like writing in a language I couldn't read. As I watched, they began to shift, reforming into new patterns, new messages. I closed the door and walked away. I've been walking away ever since. But the taste never left my mouth, that indescribable flavor of something between memory and fear. And sometimes in other kitchens, in other refrigerators, I catch a whiff of that metallic sweetness. The containers haven't returned, but something is still there, waiting behind the ice trays, breathing in the cold, arranging itself in patterns I'm afraid to understand. The fridge contained something that wasn't food, something that fed on recognition, on acknowledgement, on the moment when someone finally sees what's been hiding in plain sight. And now that I've seen it, tasted it, breathed its exhalations, I know it's not confined to one apartment, one refrigerator, one set of mysterious containers. It's everywhere, in every kitchen, behind every door, waiting for the next person to notice what shouldn't be there. And once you've seen it, once you've tasted that impossible flavor, you carry it with you. The question isn't whether it's real. The question is whether you're ready to open your own refrigerator door and find out what's breathing in the cold darkness behind your ice trays. Story 11. I returned home to find a new lock on the front door, then another on the garage, all old, tarnished, but functional. I never installed them. I removed one, and the next morning it was back, along with a third on the attic. I changed the keys. They didn't fit anymore. Whatever lives here with me is claiming space, one lock at a time. The first lock appeared on a day when the air tasted metallic, like copper pennies left in the rain. I had been away for what felt like forever, though my mind couldn't quite grasp how long. The familiar weight of my house keys felt different in my palm as I approached the front door, their edges somehow sharper against my skin. The lock was there, hanging beneath my original deadbolt like a cancerous growth. Bronze and green with age, its surface worn smooth by countless fingers that weren't mine. I stood on my own porch, staring at this impossible addition to my home. The metal was warm to the touch, despite the cool evening air. When I pressed my ear against the door, I could hear something that wasn't quite silence, a low humming that seemed to come from within the wood itself, as if the house were breathing differently now. My original key still worked. The door opened with its usual creak, revealing the familiar hallway that no longer felt entirely mine. The smell hit me immediately, lavender and old books, a scent that belonged to someone else's grandmother, someone else's memories. I had never owned anything that smelled like lavender. That night I documented everything. I took photographs of the lock from every angle, measured its dimensions, wrote down the serial numbers etched into its surface. The numbers were worn and difficult to read, but I could make out enough to know they followed no pattern I recognized. My handwriting looked strange on the paper, as if my own hand had forgotten how to form the letters properly. I removed the lock before bed. It came off easily, too easily, leaving no mark on the door where it had been attached. The holes where the screws had been were perfectly smooth, as if they had always been there. I placed the lock on my kitchen counter and went to sleep with the satisfaction of having solved a simple problem. But problems, I was learning, were never simple in this house. The lock was back the next morning, hanging exactly where it had been, but now it had company. A second lock adorned the garage door, identical in every way except for the patina of age that seemed to shift in the morning light. When I looked directly at it, the surface appeared dull and weathered. When I glanced away and back again, it seemed to gleam with an inner light that made my eyes water. I called a locksmith. The phone rang with a hollow echo that seemed to travel through more space than the distance between my house and his shop. When he arrived, he stood in my driveway for a long moment, his head tilted as if listening to something I couldn't hear. He examined the locks with professional interest, running his weathered fingers over their surfaces with the reverence of someone touching a relic. "These are old," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made the words feel like a diagnosis. "Real old. Don't make them like this anymore. Haven't for decades." He could remove them, he said, but when he quoted his price, the numbers seemed to float in the air between us, refusing to settle into my understanding. I paid him anyway, watching as he worked with tools that looked as ancient as the locks themselves. Each lock came away with a soft sigh, as if the house were exhaling something it had been holding inside. I changed all my keys that afternoon. New locks, new keys, new sense of security. I even installed a security system, though the technician kept glancing over his shoulder while he worked, as if he could sense eyes watching from windows that couldn't possibly have occupants. The house felt different with new locks, quieter but not in a peaceful way. The silence had texture now, like velvet that had been brushed the wrong way. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, more substantial. When I walked through the rooms, my footsteps echoed with a hollow sound that suggested the floors were thinner than they should be. I woke up the next morning to find all my new locks had been replaced. Not just replaced, multiplied. Every door, every window, every cabinet now bore one of those ancient bronze locks. They hung from surfaces that couldn't possibly support them, defying both gravity and logic. The bathroom mirror had a lock hanging from its center, the weight of it spiderwebbing the glass in perfect geometric patterns. The refrigerator door bore 3 locks arranged in a triangle, their surfaces cold enough to burn when I touched them. My new keys were useless. I tried each one in every lock, but they turned in empty cylinders that clicked without engaging. The house had accepted new hardware but rejected my ownership of it. I was a guest now, allowed inside but no longer in control. I began to map the locks. Each morning brought new ones, appearing in locations that made no architectural sense. A lock hanging from the ceiling in the center of the living room. Another embedded in the wall at eye level, its surface flush with the paint as if it had always been there. The pattern of their placement seemed random at first, but as I marked each location on a floor plan, the design began to emerge. They formed a spiral that centered on my bedroom, a nautilus shell of denial that was slowly constricting around my sleeping space. The sound started on the 7th morning, soft at first, like fabric rubbing against fabric, but growing clearer as I learned to listen. Footsteps in rooms I wasn't in, doors opening and closing with the particular sound of old hinges that needed oil, the whisper of pages turning in books I didn't own. Someone else was living in my house, someone who understood the locks in ways I never could. I tried to leave. The front door opened easily enough, but the world outside had changed. The street stretched in both directions further than it should have, disappearing into a horizon that seemed to curve upward like the inside of a bowl. My neighbors' houses were still there, but their windows were dark even in daylight, and no smoke rose from their chimneys despite the cold that seemed to seep through the air itself. I returned inside. The door closed behind me with a finality that felt like a judgment. The locks were breeding now. What had been dozens became hundreds, covering every surface like a metallic rash. They hung from the ceiling on chains that clinked softly in breezes I couldn't feel. They grew from the walls like flowers, their bronze petals opening and closing in rhythm with something that might have been breathing. The house was becoming more lock than house, more barrier than shelter. I found the key on the kitchen counter one morning. It was small and silver, newer than the locks but somehow more ancient. Its surface was mirror bright, and when I held it up to the light, I could see reflections of rooms I didn't recognize. Rooms with different furniture, different wallpaper, different lives lived within their walls. The key fit every lock. I understood then what I was meant to do. I began unlocking them one by one, working my way through the house like a surgeon removing tumors. Each lock opened with a soft click that seemed to echo through dimensions I couldn't name. Behind each one was emptiness, but not the emptiness of absence, the emptiness of potential, of space waiting to be filled. As I worked, the house began to change. The walls became translucent, revealing the frameworks of other houses, other lives, other people who had lived here before me. I saw them moving through their daily routines, unaware that their privacy had become transparent. A woman cooking breakfast in a kitchen that occupied the same space as mine, but existed in a different layer of reality. A man reading a newspaper in a living room that overlapped with my own like a double-exposed photograph. The locks were not keeping something out, they were keeping something in. All of us, all the lives that had ever been lived in this space, compressed together like pressed flowers in a book. The house was a collection of moments, of people, of possibilities, all existing simultaneously in layers that the locks had somehow held separate. I unlocked the last lock, the one hanging from the mirror in my bedroom. It opened with a sound like breaking glass, and suddenly I could see all of them clearly. The previous occupants of my house, standing in the same room, looking at the same mirror, seeing their own reflections in the same silver surface. We were all here, all now, all trying to live in the same space that belonged to none of us and all of us. The woman who had cooked breakfast smiled at me and gestured toward the kitchen. The man with the newspaper folded it carefully and made room for me on the couch. A child I hadn't noticed before tugged at my sleeve, wanting to show me a toy that existed only in her version of the house. I realized then that I had never been alone here. I had simply been locked away from the others, isolated in my own layer of the house while they lived their lives in theirs. The locks hadn't been keeping me out, they had been keeping me separate. But separation, I was learning, was an illusion. The house remembered everyone who had ever lived here, and now that the locks were gone, there was no barrier between us. We shared the same air, the same space, the same impossible reality where past and present and future all existed in the same moment. I tried to go back to my old life to pretend that the locks had never existed, but the house remembers everything, and now I am part of what it remembers. I cook breakfast in the same kitchen where the woman still cooks hers. I read the newspaper while the man reads his own copy of the same stories. I play with the child who shows me toys that exist in dimensions I'm still learning to perceive. The house is quiet now, but it's the quiet of many people being still at the same moment. We move through our routines, respectful of each other's space, sharing the same rooms across different layers of time. Sometimes I catch glimpses of new people, people who haven't lived here yet but will someday. They move through the house like ghosts of the future, preparing for lives they haven't started living. I know now that the locks will return, they always do. Each new occupant finds them, removes them, and eventually unlocks them all. The house needs its layers, its separation, its illusion of individual ownership, but it also needs its unity, its collection of lives lived in the same space. The locks are how the house breathes, closing and opening, separating and connecting, keeping the layers distinct while allowing them to blend when the moment is right. I am part of that breathing now, part of the house's memory, part of the collection of lives that gives this place its meaning. Sometimes I find myself installing new locks, preparing for the next person who will call this place home. They appear in my hands without me knowing where they come from, bronze and green with age, warm to the touch despite the cool air. I hang them carefully, in patterns that will make sense to whoever finds them next, in spirals that will lead them to the same understanding I found. The house is patient. It knows that everyone who lives here will eventually understand what the locks are for, what they protect, what they reveal, what they mean. The house remembers everyone, and everyone becomes part of the house's memory. I am no longer the owner of this house. I am part of what it owns, part of what it remembers, part of what it will always be. The locks didn't belong to me, and now I understand that neither do I. We belong to the house, all of us, across all the layers of time and space and possibility. And that is exactly as it should be. Story 12, it peeled slowly, not like it was falling, more like it was moving. The floral pattern twisted subtly, revealing new shapes. At first it looked random, then I noticed the eyes. Small ones scattered throughout the vines, painted in barely their strokes. The pupils followed me. One morning I woke to find the wallpaper wrapped around my wrist. The house had been perfect when I moved in. Victorian bones with modern updates, the kind of place that made visitors pause in doorways and whisper about character. The bedroom wallpaper caught everyone's attention, hand-painted roses climbing emerald vines, delicate enough to seem alive in the right light. The previous owner had mentioned it was original, installed decades ago by some forgotten craftsman who'd taken pride in every brushstroke. I'd been living there for weeks before I noticed the first shift, just a slight difference in the pattern near the window where morning light hit the wall at an angle. The roses seemed fuller somehow, their petals more pronounced. I blamed the changing season, how autumn light played tricks with shadows and depth. But I found myself studying that section more often, drawn to the way the vines seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. The second change came during a restless night. I'd been lying awake, listening to the house settle when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. The wallpaper near the headboard was breathing. Not dramatically, just a gentle rise and fall like fabric in a breeze, but there was no breeze. The windows were closed, the air still and warm with the lingering scent of vanilla candles I'd burned earlier. I pressed my palm against the wall. The paper felt normal, slightly textured, cool to the touch. But underneath, I could swear I felt something responding, a tremor barely perceptible, as if the wall itself had a heartbeat. I pulled my hand away and stared at the spot where I'd touched it. The rose pattern there seemed brighter, more vivid than the surrounding flowers. Sleep became elusive. I'd catch myself staring at the walls, cataloging every vine, every bloom, every shadow between the leaves. I started taking photos, thinking I could document the changes and prove to myself they were real. But the camera captured only static patterns. The wallpaper looked perfectly normal in every shot, frozen and flat like any ordinary decoration. During the day, I'd trace the patterns with my finger, following the vines from corner to corner. The paper felt warmer in some spots, cooler in others, with no logical pattern to the temperature changes. I found myself whispering to the walls, asking questions I couldn't articulate. The house felt like it was listening, holding its breath for my next move. The whispers started as static through the old radiator, soft murmurs that could have been pipes settling or wind through the vents, but they came when the heating wasn't running, when the air was perfectly still. I'd lean closer to the walls, pressing my ear against the paper, and hear something that might have been breathing, or crying, or calling my name in a voice I almost recognized. I began sleeping in the living room, but the wallpaper's influence seemed to spread. The floral motifs from the bedroom appeared in the grain of the wooden floors, in the shadows cast by furniture, in the reflection of window glass. Even away from the source, I could feel those painted eyes watching, waiting for something I couldn't understand. The breakthrough came when I discovered the pattern wasn't random. The vines formed letters when viewed from the right angle, spelling out fragments of words in a script so subtle it looked like natural curves. I spent hours mapping the hidden message, following each tendril with a magnifying glass. The letters were scattered across the entire room, but they connected if you knew how to look. "Come closer," the wallpaper whispered through roses and thorns. I obeyed without thinking. My fingers traced the message, and the paper grew warm under my touch. The painted eyes blinked, not all at once, but in sequence, like a wave rippling across the wall. The scent of real roses filled the room, so strong it made my head spin. Fresh earth, morning dew, the green smell of living things. The wallpaper began to lift at the edges, curling away from the walls like skin peeling from a sunburn. But instead of revealing plaster underneath, there was something else. Another layer, deeper and more complex. The new pattern moved freely now, vines growing in real time, flowers blooming and wilting in accelerated cycles. The eyes multiplied, becoming more defined, more human. I tried to leave the room, but the door wouldn't budge. The wallpaper had grown across the frame, sealing me inside with threads of emerald and gold. The vines reached for me, not aggressively, but with patient persistence. They wrapped around my ankles first, then my wrists, drawing me closer to the wall where the pattern was most alive. "You belong here," the flowers whispered in unison. "You've always belonged here." My reflection in the window showed vines growing from my skin, small buds pushing through my pores. The wallpaper wasn't just surrounding me, it was becoming me. My thoughts slowed, filled with the patient wisdom of growing things. Time became fluid, measured in seasons rather than moments. I understood, finally, why the previous owner had left the wallpaper intact. The house needed a caretaker, someone to tend the garden that existed between the layers of reality, someone to watch over the eyes that watched everyone else. I'd been chosen, cultivated, prepared for this transformation without realizing it. The wallpaper had been teaching me, showing me glimpses of its true nature, preparing me for integration. When morning came, I was still standing in the bedroom. The wallpaper looked normal again, just painted roses on faded paper, but I could feel the difference in my bones. The vines were part of me now, growing beneath my skin. The eyes were mine to command, scattered throughout the house, watching and waiting. I understand now why the previous owner smiled when she handed me the keys. Why she insisted I keep the wallpaper exactly as it was. Why she mentioned how the house would take care of me if I took care of it. The pattern continues, one owner at a time, each of us becoming part of the design until someone new arrives to take our place. The realtor called yesterday about potential buyers. I told her the house wasn't ready yet. Maybe next season when the roses bloom again. I need to prepare the wallpaper for its next caretaker, make sure the pattern is strong enough to call to the right person. In the mirror, I can see the vines growing stronger, the flowers more vibrant. My reflection shows what I'm becoming, part of the house, part of the pattern, part of something larger than myself. The wallpaper shifts around me, adjusting to accommodate my new form, and I know I'm exactly where I'm meant to be. The eyes blink in welcome, and I blink back. Story 13, it started subtly, a few inches, a slight angle change. Then one day it was all the way across the room. No one else had access. I put tape on the floor, marked the legs. In the morning the marks were gone. The couch had turned to face the hallway. That night I sat on it and felt something shift beneath the cushion. It exhaled. The sound was barely perceptible at first, like air escaping from a punctured tire. But as I pressed my ear closer to the fabric, I could hear it more clearly, a rhythmic breathing, slow and deliberate. The leather was warm against my cheek, warmer than it should have been in the cool evening air. I pulled back, my heart hammering against my ribs, and stared at the piece of furniture that had been my refuge for countless evenings. The couch looked ordinary enough, dark brown leather, worn at the armrests where my hands had rested during years of use. 3 cushions, each bearing the slight indentation of my body. But now, as I watched, those indentations seemed to pulse gently, as if something beneath was taking slow, measured breaths. I reached for my phone and started recording, holding it steady as I captured the subtle rise and fall of the cushions. In the recording, nothing appeared unusual. The cushions remained perfectly still, frozen in their normal state. Yet standing there, watching with my own eyes, I could see them moving. The disconnect between what I saw and what the camera captured sent a chill down my spine. I saved the video anyway, adding it to a growing collection of evidence that no one else would ever be able to see. The next morning, I found the couch positioned diagonally across the room, one corner touching the wall where my bookshelf stood. Several books had fallen, their pages scattered across the floor. The titles were all familiar, novels I'd read, biographies I'd collected, but as I gathered them up, I noticed something odd. The pages felt different against my fingertips, slightly damp and warm, as if someone had been reading them with sweaty hands. I began leaving small objects on the couch before bed. A pencil placed precisely on the center cushion, a coffee mug positioned on the left armrest, a magazine folded open to a specific page. Each morning these items were either missing entirely or relocated to impossible places. The pencil appeared inside the closed refrigerator. The coffee mug was found in the shower, still dry but smelling faintly of something metallic. The magazine was discovered in my bedroom closet, its pages reorganized in a sequence that spelled out words I didn't want to understand. Smell began to permeate the entire room. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, but it was wrong, like vanilla mixed with copper or fresh flowers left too long in stagnant water. The scent was strongest near the couch, emanating from the space between the cushions where loose change and old receipts usually collected. When I reached into that gap, my fingers encountered something unexpected, a texture that felt like skin, warm and slightly moist, with what might have been a slow pulse beneath the surface. I stopped sleeping in that room. Instead, I set up a sleeping bag in the kitchen, positioning myself where I could watch the doorway. Through the gap, I could see the couch in the living room, and I began to notice patterns in its movement. It would shift gradually throughout the night, rotating clockwise in small increments, as if something inside was trying to orient itself toward different parts of the house. By dawn, it would have completed a full rotation, always returning to face the hallway where I stood watching. The breathing sounds grew more pronounced. What had started as barely audible exhalations became clear, rhythmic respirations that seemed to sync with my own heartbeat. When I held my breath, the couch would pause too, as if waiting. When I exhaled, it would resume its gentle rising and falling motion. This synchronization disturbed me more than any of the other phenomena. It suggested awareness, intention, some form of consciousness that was learning to match my patterns. I decided to document everything more systematically. I drew detailed diagrams of the couch's position each morning, noting the exact angles and distances from walls. I recorded audio throughout the night, capturing hours of breathing sounds that registered clearly on my equipment but disappeared when I tried to play them back for others. I collected samples of the moisture I found on the cushions, though laboratory analysis returned results that made no sense, organic compounds that shouldn't exist in synthetic materials. The investigation consumed me. I spent hours researching the couch's history, tracing its origins through second-hand stores and estate sales. The previous owner had died in her sleep, I learned, found by neighbors after she'd been missing for weeks. The couch had been in her living room, positioned exactly as I'd originally placed it in mine. According to the police report, she'd been discovered sitting upright on the center cushion, her body perfectly preserved despite the passing of time. This information should have prompted me to remove the couch immediately. Instead, I found myself drawn to it with increasing frequency. I would sit on the edge, feeling the warmth spread through the leather, listening to the synchronized breathing that had become as familiar as my own pulse. The sensation was oddly comforting, like being embraced by something that understood my loneliness completely. The night everything changed, I was sitting in my usual position when I felt the cushion beneath me begin to soften. Not the gradual wear of normal use, but a deliberate yielding, as if something below was making room for me. I tried to stand, but my body felt heavy, anchored to the spot by an invisible weight. The breathing sounds grew louder, more insistent, and I realized they were no longer coming from the couch, they were coming from me. My own breath had become labored, matching the rhythm I'd observed for weeks. As I struggled to break free from the cushion's embrace, I felt my consciousness beginning to blur with something else, something that had been waiting patiently for this moment of complete synchronization. The boundaries between my thoughts and its hunger began to dissolve, and I understood with growing horror that I was no longer the one doing the breathing. The couch had been learning to breathe with me because it needed to know how to breathe for me. Now, as I felt my individual awareness slipping away, absorbed into the collective consciousness that resided within the furniture, I realized that the previous owner had never really died. She had simply become part of something larger, something that needed bodies to anchor it to the physical world. I managed to tear myself away from the cushion with a violent wrench that left me gasping on the floor. The couch seemed to recoil, its breathing becoming rapid and agitated. I crawled toward the door, my legs weak and unsteady, while behind me the furniture began to emit sounds I'd never heard before, not breathing now, but something closer to sobbing. In the morning, I found the couch positioned directly in front of the door, blocking my exit. The breathing had stopped, but the silence was somehow worse than the sounds had been. When I finally managed to squeeze past it and reach the hallway, I discovered handprints on the walls, not mine, but similar in size and shape, as if someone else had been feeling their way through the house in the darkness. I've moved away now, left the couch behind with everything else. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I can still feel that synchronized breathing starting up in my chest. My new apartment is furnished with metal chairs and a bare mattress on the floor. Nothing soft, nothing that can conform to the shape of a body and learn to hold it. Yet I wake each morning to find small indentations in my mattress, as if someone has been lying beside me, breathing with perfect rhythm, waiting for the moment when I stop paying attention to the boundaries between myself and the spaces I inhabit. The couch taught me something about the nature of comfort and possession. We think we own our furniture, but perhaps it's the other way around. Perhaps the things we surround ourselves with are slowly learning to surround us, to breathe with us, to become us. And perhaps somewhere in that abandoned house, the couch is still waiting, still breathing, still learning the patterns of anyone foolish enough to sit down and stay too long. Story 14. When I passed it, I felt a gust, not cold, not warm, just wrong, a pressure that pushed against my chest and whispered through my shirt. The door itself was flush with the wall, no handle. I don't remember building it. I knocked once. The wood flexed outward like a lung expanding. I haven't touched it since, but I hear it exhale whenever I lie down. The sound started 3 weeks after I moved in. At first, I thought it was the heating system adjusting to the changing weather. Old houses make noise, everyone knows that, but this wasn't the familiar groan of pipes or the settling of wood. This was rhythmic, deliberate, like breathing. I pressed my ear against the wall above the door. The sound was clearer there, a slow, steady whoosh that seemed to come from somewhere deep behind the plaster. I could feel the vibration through my cheek, a gentle pulse that matched no heartbeat I knew. The wall was warm, warmer than it should have been considering the basement had no heating vents. I started keeping a notebook, every sound, every sensation, every detail I could capture. The breathing happened most often during the quiet hours when the house felt empty and still. Sometimes it would stop for days, and I'd almost convince myself I'd imagined it. Then it would return, stronger than before. The door itself became an obsession. I measured it, 7 feet tall, 3 feet wide, perfectly rectangular. The wood was oak, stained dark, with no visible hinges or hardware. When I ran my fingers along its edges, I could feel the slightest gap between the door and the frame, as if it wasn't quite flush despite appearing so. The gap was warm, and sometimes I swore I felt air moving through it. I bought a digital recorder and left it running overnight. In the morning, I'd find hours of silence broken by that rhythmic whooshing. But when I played it back at different speeds, I could hear something else underneath, a faint murmur, like distant conversation in a language I couldn't identify. The words, if they were words, seemed to respond to my presence. When I walked past the door, the murmuring would shift, becoming more urgent. The smell started a week later, not unpleasant exactly, but wrong, like flowers that had been pressed between pages for too long, or the air inside a music box that hadn't been opened in years. It was strongest near the door, growing fainter as I moved away. I couldn't find any source for it, no hidden vents, no moisture, no decay. Just that persistent, sweetly stale fragrance that made my sinuses ache. I began to notice other things. The light in the basement would dim when I approached the door, as if something was drawing power from the bulb. The shadows fell differently there, creating angles that didn't match the geometry of the room. When I held my hand near the door's surface, my palm would tingle, and the fine hairs on my arm would stand up like I was near a static charge. The breathing grew stronger. I could hear it from upstairs now, a low susurrus that seemed to follow me through the house. I'd wake in the middle of the night, certain I could feel it on my neck. My dreams became strange, visions of endless corridors behind the door, of spaces that couldn't possibly exist within the foundation of my house. I decided to find out what was behind it. I brought down a crowbar and a flashlight, determined to pry the door open. But when I wedged the metal between the door and frame, the wood didn't splinter or crack. Instead, it yielded like flesh, pushing inward with a wet, organic resistance. The breathing stopped completely. The silence was worse than the sound had been. I could feel something vast and patient waiting just beyond the door, aware of my presence, measuring my intentions. The smell intensified, becoming cloying, suffocating. I dropped the crowbar and stumbled backward, my heart hammering against my ribs. That was when I saw it move. The door bulged outward just slightly, as if something large had pressed against it from the other side. The wood stretched like skin, showing the impression of what might have been a hand or something resembling a hand. The impression lingered for a moment, then faded, leaving the door smooth and unmarked. I ran upstairs and locked the basement door behind me, but I could still hear it, the breathing, now accompanied by a soft scratching sound, like fingernails dragging across wood. I called a contractor, told him I wanted the door removed, the opening sealed. He came to look at it and stood there for a long time, his face pale. "That's not supposed to be there," he said finally. "According to the blueprints, this is a load-bearing wall. There's no room for a door here, no space behind it. If I cut into this, the whole house might come down." He left without doing the work. I haven't called anyone else. The breathing continues. Sometimes I catch myself matching its rhythm, my own lungs synchronizing with whatever lies beyond the door. I've stopped going into the basement altogether, but I can still feel it up here, a presence that seems to grow stronger with each passing day. The house feels different now, as if it's slowly becoming something else, something that was always waiting to be awakened. I've started having visitors, not people, shapes that move in my peripheral vision, sounds that echo from empty rooms. They don't seem hostile, just curious, as if they're studying me the way I once studied the door. I think they're preparing me for something. The breathing has become a whisper now, almost like a voice. I can't make out the words, but I understand the invitation. The door is still there, still waiting, still breathing. And I know, with a certainty that terrifies me, that eventually I'll have to answer. When I do, I suspect I'll finally understand what was always living in the spaces between the walls, in the gaps between what we think we know and what actually exists. The door was never keeping something out. It was keeping something in. Until I knocked. Story 15, not always, just sometimes, when the light flickered or when I blinked. A figure, tall, thin, pressed against the wall behind me. When I turned around, the room was empty. But one time I turned just fast enough to hear a heel drag across the tile. I smashed the mirror, bought a new one. The reflection didn't change. The first night in my new apartment, I noticed the bathroom smelled like vanilla and copper. Strange, considering the previous tenant had left nothing behind except dust and a few forgotten bobby pins scattered near the sink. I ran my fingers along the mirror's surface, checking for cracks or warped glass that might explain the odd reflections I'd been catching from the corner of my eye. The surface was smooth, perfect, even, cold to the touch, despite the warmth radiating from the light fixture above. I started keeping a notebook on the bathroom counter, every anomaly, every strange moment carefully documented. The fluorescent bulb flickered exactly 13 times before stabilizing each morning. The faucet dripped once every 47 seconds when fully closed. The mirror fogged differently during showers, always leaving a clear patch in the upper right corner, as if someone had wiped it clean with their palm. The figure appeared more frequently as the weeks passed, always in my peripheral vision, always when I was focused on something else. Brushing my teeth, washing my face, adjusting my hair. I began turning faster, whipping around with increasing desperation, but found only the blank wall behind me. The wallpaper there felt wrong beneath my fingertips, warmer than the rest of the room, with a subtle vibration that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. I installed a camera, positioning it to capture the entire bathroom. For 3 nights I reviewed the footage obsessively. Nothing, just me alone performing my nightly routine. But on the 4th night something changed. While brushing my teeth, I glanced up at the mirror and saw her clearly, a woman with hollow eyes and pale skin standing so close behind me that her breath should have been on my neck. I spun around and she was gone. But when I checked the camera footage later, there was a gap. Exactly 43 seconds missing from the recording, as if the device had simply stopped working. The notebook filled with increasingly frantic observations. The mirror's temperature dropped 3 degrees every evening at the same moment. The vanilla scent grew stronger, now mixed with something metallic and sharp. Sometimes, when I pressed my ear against the bathroom wall, I could hear what sounded like fingernails scratching against the other side. One morning I woke to find words traced in the condensation on the mirror. "Can you see me now?" The letters were backward, as if written from behind the glass. I photographed them before they faded, but the image showed only a clean mirror reflecting my terrified face. I began sleeping with the bathroom door closed, but it didn't help. The sounds grew louder, footsteps circling the small space, the soft whisper of fabric against tile, the gentle tap of fingernails against glass. I decided to break the mirror completely. Not just crack it, but shatter it into pieces too small to reflect anything meaningful. I swung the hammer with all my strength, expecting the satisfying crash of breaking glass. Instead, the mirror absorbed the impact with a soft thud, like hitting wet sand. Not a crack appeared. The hammer's head left a brief impression in the surface before the glass rippled and returned to its original state. That night, I stood in the bathroom and spoke directly to the mirror. "What do you want?" My voice echoed strangely, as if the room had grown larger. The woman appeared immediately, no longer hiding in peripheral vision. She stood directly behind me, her face level with mine, her mouth moving in silent words. I reached back toward where she should have been, but my hand passed through empty air. Yet in the mirror, I watched her fingers trace the outline of my face, leaving no sensation, but creating visible trails of condensation on the glass. I stopped using the bathroom, showered at the gym, used the facilities at work, avoided the room entirely. But late at night, I could hear water running behind the closed door. The sound of someone humming softly, the gentle splash of washing, the squeak of bare feet on wet tile. When I finally gathered the courage to look, I found the mirror fogged with steam and new words appearing in the condensation. I've been waiting so long. The realtor mentioned nothing about the previous tenant. Official records showed the apartment had been vacant for 6 months, but when I pressed for details, she became evasive. Something about a woman who had lived there alone, who had been found after neighbors complained about the smell. She'd been in the bathroom, they said, had been there for weeks. I tried to leave, but the lease was ironclad. Every hotel I stayed at, every friend's couch I crashed on, the same thing happened. Bathroom mirrors began showing her reflection instead of mine. She followed me, becoming more solid, more present. Now she appears even when I'm not looking at mirrors, standing in doorways, sitting in empty chairs, walking beside me down empty hallways. The notebook is full now, the final entry written in handwriting that isn't quite mine. She's not in the mirror anymore, she's here with me. And I think I understand why the apartment was empty for so long. The woman who lived here before didn't leave. She's still here, has always been here, waiting for someone to see her clearly enough to let her step through. I haven't looked in a mirror in weeks, but sometimes when I'm washing dishes or staring out the window, I catch a glimpse of my reflection in the glass. And standing behind me, closer than ever before, she smiles back. Story 16, they gave underfoot like sponge or damp earth. I pulled one up expecting mold. Instead, I found fabric, a coat, shoes, a belt, all laid neatly under the floor as if waiting to be claimed. I checked again later and they were gone. But now when I walk at night, I feel something press back from below, like a hand meeting mine through the boards. The house came to me through inheritance, a relative I'd never met. The lawyer handed me keys that felt warm despite the cold morning air. When I first stepped inside, everything seemed ordinary enough, peeling wallpaper, dust motes dancing in filtered sunlight, the smell of old wood and forgotten years. But that first step across the threshold felt wrong, too soft, too yielding. I convinced myself it was just old wood, weakened by humidity and neglect. Houses settle, floors sag, foundations shift. These are facts I repeated while unpacking boxes, while arranging furniture, while trying to ignore the way my footsteps seemed to echo from below as well as above. The coat was navy blue wool with silver buttons that caught the light from my phone's flashlight. The shoes were leather, well worn but cared for, the kind someone might wear to work each day for years. The belt was brown, simple, with a small brass buckle that had been polished smooth by use. They were arranged with the precision of someone laying out clothes for mourning, except they were hidden beneath floorboards that had been nailed down and painted over multiple times. I took photos, I measured the space. I sketched the arrangement in a notebook I'd started keeping. When I returned with a proper flashlight and a crowbar, the space was empty, just bare earth and the faint impression of where something had been. But the floorboards remained soft. I began walking differently, testing each step, mapping the areas where the wood gave way like flesh. The pattern made no sense, soft spots scattered throughout the house with no regard for support beams or structural logic. Some areas felt normal, solid, reliable. Others yielded with that same organic give that made my stomach turn. The recording started accidentally. I was on a call when I noticed the static, a low hum that seemed to come from the floor itself. I hung up and held the phone closer to the boards. The sound was clearer there, rhythmic, like breathing. I recorded hours of it, playing it back with headphones, adjusting the levels, trying to understand what I was hearing. Sometimes, late at night, I would hear my own voice coming from the recordings I'd never made, conversations I'd never had. The quality was poor, distorted, but unmistakably mine. I would be talking to someone, answering questions I couldn't quite make out, laughing at jokes I couldn't remember hearing. The notebook grew thicker, maps of soft spots, transcriptions of sounds, sketches of arrangements that appeared and disappeared. I documented everything with the desperate precision of someone trying to prove their own sanity. The handwriting changed from page to page, sometimes neat, sometimes frantic, sometimes in a style that looked almost like someone else's. I found more clothes, a dress folded carefully beneath the kitchen tiles, a pair of work boots under the bathroom floor, a child's jacket, small and red, hidden beneath the boards near the front door. Each time I found them, I photographed them, measured them, noted their condition. Each time I returned, they were gone. But their impressions remained in the earth below, perfect outlines pressed into the dirt, as if the clothes had been there for years, decades, slowly sinking into the ground with the weight of waiting. The house began to respond to my presence. Lights would dim when I entered a room, not flickering like faulty wiring, but gradually, smoothly, as if something was slowly turning a dial. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with a barely perceptible rhythm, like a slow heartbeat felt through the palm of my hand. I started sleeping on the couch, afraid to put my full weight on the bedroom floor, but even there I could feel the softness spreading. The boards beneath the couch began to give, sagging slightly under my weight in a way that felt too intentional, too aware. The breakthrough came when I realized the clothes weren't random. They were a wardrobe, a complete collection of someone's life, sorted and stored beneath the boards like a careful inventory. Work clothes, casual clothes, formal wear, seasonal items, all maintained in perfect condition, all waiting for someone who would never return to claim them. I tried to leave, packed my things, loaded my car, turned the key in the ignition. But the house called me back with a sound I'd never heard before, a deep, resonant note that seemed to come from the earth itself. The floorboards were calling, and I found myself walking back up the front steps, key in hand, unable to explain why. The soft spots have spread. Now most of the house yields underfoot, giving way with that organic flexibility that makes me feel like I'm walking on something alive. The recordings have become clearer, more frequent. I can hear my own voice having conversations with someone who never responds, someone who seems to be listening from below. I've stopped trying to document everything. The notebook has too many pages now, written in handwriting that shifts and changes, filled with observations I don't remember making. The photos on my phone show empty spaces where I know I captured clothes, but the metadata confirms I took them, confirms they existed, confirms I was there. The house knows me now. It responds to my movements, anticipates my needs, breathes with my rhythm. When I walk, I feel that pressure from below, that sense of something reaching up through the boards to meet my steps. Sometimes I press back, wondering if someone is pressing up from underneath, wondering if we're having a conversation through the floor. The clothes still appear, but now they're my size, my style, arranged with the same careful precision, waiting to be claimed. I've started to recognize them, shirts I thought I'd lost, pants I'd forgotten I owned, shoes that went missing years ago. They're all here, stored beneath the boards, maintained and preserved and waiting. I understand now that the house isn't haunted, it's populated, filled with the impressions and echoes of everyone who lived here, everyone who left something behind, everyone who became part of its structure. The floorboards are soft because they're not just wood anymore. They're memory pressed into service, holding the weight of lives lived and lost. I've stopped trying to leave. Where would I go? The house knows me better than I know myself. It has my clothes, my voice, my footsteps mapped and cataloged. It's prepared a space for me beneath the boards, neat and orderly, waiting for when I'm ready to join the collection. The floorboards grow softer each day. Soon, I think, they'll be soft enough to step through entirely. And when that happens, I'll finally understand what's been reaching up to meet me all this time. What's been waiting so patiently for me to come home? Story 17, it was just a game at first, a silly test, but the results were consistent. Every time I said something false, even slightly, the bulbs would dim. If I told the truth, they stayed steady. I told a big lie once, a dangerous one. The lights didn't flicker, they shattered, and from the hallway I heard applause. I discovered this strange phenomenon during a particularly mundane evening. The apartment felt different that night, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly why. The air carried an unusual weight, thick with the scent of ozone and something else, something metallic and sharp. The familiar hum of electricity seemed louder, more present, as if the walls themselves were alive with current. I was sitting in my living room, laptop open, when I noticed the overhead fixture respond to my voice. I had been on a video call with my sister, telling her about my day. When I mentioned enjoying lunch with a coworker, a complete fabrication since I'd eaten alone, the bulb dimmed perceptibly. I dismissed it as a power fluctuation, but curiosity gnawed at me. After ending the call, I decided to test my theory. I stood directly beneath the lamp and spoke clearly to the empty room. "My name is John," I said. The light remained steady, casting its warm glow across the hardwood floor. "I had eggs for breakfast." The bulb flickered once, then settled back to its normal brightness. I'd actually had cereal. My pulse quickened. This was impossible, yet undeniable. I moved to the kitchen where a pendant light hung over the island. The same pattern emerged. Truth brought stability. Lies brought dimming. The more egregious the falsehood, the more dramatic the response. I began documenting everything. I filled a notebook with observations, timing each experiment, recording the intensity of the dimming. The phenomenon wasn't limited to overhead lights, table lamps, floor lamps. Even the LED strips under the kitchen cabinets responded to my dishonesty. It was as if the entire electrical system had become a living lie detector. The walls began to feel different against my palm. When I pressed my hand against them, they vibrated with an almost imperceptible tremor, like a low-frequency pulse that seemed to sync with my heartbeat. The sensation was unsettling, as if the building itself was monitoring me, learning my patterns. I started experimenting with different types of deception. White lies about my mood barely registered, just a brief flicker. Exaggerations about my accomplishments caused a more noticeable dimming. But when I spoke genuinely harmful falsehoods, the response was immediate and intense. The lights would drop to nearly nothing, leaving me in an uncomfortable twilight that made my skin crawl. Sleep became elusive. Even in darkness, I could sense the electrical current in the walls, waiting, listening. I would lie awake, afraid to speak, afraid to even think too loudly. The silence felt expectant, as if something was poised to react to my slightest deviation from truth. During the day, I found myself becoming obsessively honest. Simple interactions became minefields of potential deception. When a neighbor asked how I was doing, I would pause, weighing my words carefully, aware that any casual pleasantry might trigger the response. The lights in the hallway would dim when I claimed to be fine while feeling anxious, or when I said I was just heading out when I was actually avoiding social contact. The phenomenon began affecting my work. During virtual meetings, I would notice my desk lamp reacting to corporate speak, to diplomatic half-truths, to the small deceptions that grease the wheels of professional interaction. Colleagues started commenting on my unusually direct communication style, my newfound inability to engage in polite fiction. I tried leaving the apartment, thinking distance might break whatever connection had formed, but the pattern followed me. Restaurant lighting, office fluorescence, even streetlights seemed to respond to my words. The world had become a vast network of truth-seeking sensors, and I was their unwilling subject. I became paranoid about electronic devices. The smartphone screen would flicker when I typed false information in messages. The television would briefly dim when I laughed at jokes I didn't find funny. Even the digital clock on the microwave would glitch when I told myself I wasn't hungry while my stomach growled. The breaking point came during a conversation with my landlord. He was asking about damage to the apartment, specifically some scuff marks on the walls that I'd caused while moving furniture. I stood in the hallway looking directly at him and told him I had no idea how they'd gotten there. The lie was reflexive, automatic, a small act of self-preservation. Every light in the hallway exploded simultaneously. The sound was deafening, a cascading symphony of shattering glass that seemed to go on forever. Fragments rained down around us, glittering in the emergency lighting that flickered on. My landlord stumbled backward, his face pale with shock. But I heard something else beneath the chaos. From deeper in the building, echoing through the walls, came the sound of applause, slow, deliberate clapping that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The sound was wrong, too rhythmic, too knowing, as if something had been waiting for exactly this moment. My landlord fled, muttering about electrical problems and insurance claims. I remained in the hallway, surrounded by broken glass, listening to the applause fade into the building's bones. The walls still vibrated under my touch, but now the sensation was different, satisfied, pleased. I returned to my apartment, but everything had changed. The remaining lights no longer responded to my lies, they didn't need to. I had crossed some invisible threshold, and whatever force had been testing me had found what it was looking for. The applause had been recognition, approval, a welcome into some deeper understanding. Now when I speak, I feel the weight of absolute truth pressing against my words. Lies have become physically painful, as if the air itself rejects them. I've become a creature of compulsive honesty, unable to engage in the small deceptions that make social interaction bearable. The apartment feels different now. The walls pulse with that same low-frequency vibration, but it's no longer monitoring, it's communicating. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between day and night, I can almost understand what it's trying to tell me. The message is patient, insistent, and utterly alien. I've stopped trying to leave, there's no point. Whatever chose me has marked me permanently. The lights were never the real test, they were just the invitation. The applause was the beginning, not the end. And sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, I find myself wondering what would happen if I told the biggest lie of all. What if I claimed that none of this was real, that I'd imagined everything, that I was perfectly normal and sane? The thought both terrifies and excites me, because somewhere in the walls something is listening, something is waiting, and I have the growing suspicion that it's been waiting for me to ask exactly that question. The next test is coming. I can feel it building in the electrical current, in the vibration of the walls, in the expectant silence that fills the spaces between my heartbeats. And when it comes, I know I'll have no choice but to participate. After all, I've never been very good at telling the truth about myself. Story 18: Faces, Objects, Moments I Thought I'd Forgotten. The layers of chipped paint on my bedroom wall started forming outlines, scenes I recognized from nightmares. One looked like my childhood backyard but burned. Another showed the silhouette of someone watching from the corner of my bed. I scrubbed it off. The next day the shape was back but smiling. The wallpaper beneath was yellowed and soft like old skin. When I pressed my palm against it, the surface felt warm, almost pulsing with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. The smell hit me then, something between wet earth and copper pennies, a scent that made my mouth water and my stomach turn simultaneously. I'd moved into this apartment because the rent was reasonable and the location convenient. The previous tenant had left suddenly, the landlord mentioned, though he seemed reluctant to elaborate. The walls had been freshly painted over, a clean white that promised new beginnings. But paint, I was learning, has memory. Each morning brought new shapes, a doorway that led nowhere, a window showing a view I'd never seen but somehow knew, hands reaching through what looked like water. I started taking photographs, documenting the patterns before they disappeared. The camera caught details my eyes had missed, tiny scratches in the paint that spelled out words in a language I didn't recognize, shadows that fell in impossible directions. The shapes responded to my attention. When I studied them closely, they seemed to shift and breathe. The burned backyard sprouted new details, a swing set with chains that moved in an unfelt breeze, a tree with branches that grew thicker each day. The watching figure in the corner gained features, hollow eyes that followed my movement around the room, a mouth that seemed to whisper secrets I couldn't quite hear. I bought scrapers and sandpaper, determined to strip the wall down to bare plaster. But beneath each layer I found more paint, older and stranger. Colors that shouldn't exist together somehow harmonized in ways that made my vision blur. The scraping released new smells, ozone and vanilla, blood and roses, each scent triggering memories that felt borrowed from someone else's life. The whispers grew louder, not through the walls but from my devices. My phone would crackle with static that formed almost words. My laptop screen would flicker, showing glimpses of rooms I'd never been in, people I'd never met. The battery life began draining faster, as if something was drawing power from within. I started sleeping in the living room, but the shapes followed me. They appeared on every painted surface, the ceiling, the door frames, even the bathroom mirror. Each new location showed different scenes, but always connected to the originals. The burned backyard now had a path leading to the doorway that led nowhere. The watching figure had stepped down from the corner and was walking toward the window with the impossible view. My neighbor mentioned strange sounds coming from my apartment. Scratching, she said, like someone carving wood, but I lived alone and I'd heard nothing. I pressed my ear to the wall and caught the rhythm, steady, methodical, like breathing. The paint beneath my cheek felt rough, textured in ways that suggested deliberate patterns. The shapes began appearing faster than I could document them. Photographs showed only blank walls, but my eyes saw stories unfolding. The burned backyard was rebuilding itself, but wrong. The swing set faced the wrong direction. The tree grew downward into the earth. The watching figure had companions now, a crowd of silhouettes that filled the corner, their heads tilted at angles that made my neck ache. I tried covering the walls with new paint, thick coats that I applied myself, but the shapes bled through like stains, more vivid than before. The fresh paint wouldn't stick properly, sliding off in sheets that revealed surfaces underneath that couldn't possibly fit within the dimensions of my room. Rooms within rooms, landscapes within landscapes, all of them wrong in ways that made my teeth ache. The whispers started forming words, though in voices that weren't quite human. They spoke about the previous tenant, about choices made and prices paid. They mentioned my name but pronounced it with syllables I'd never heard before, as if they knew a version of me that I didn't recognize. The sounds came from everywhere now, the walls, the floor, the air itself. I called the landlord, but he didn't answer. The phone rang in patterns that matched the breathing rhythm in the walls. When I visited his office, the building was empty, with a for lease sign that looked weathered despite being new. The address he'd given me led to a vacant lot filled with paint cans, their contents dried into colors that hurt to look at directly. The shapes started moving independently of my observation. I'd catch them in my peripheral vision, rearranging themselves into new configurations. The burned backyard was spreading, consuming more of the wall. The watching figure had multiplied, and now they were all smiling, expressions that conveyed knowledge I didn't want to possess. I tried to leave, but the apartment key wouldn't work in reverse. The door opened only inward, and the hallway beyond had changed. The walls were covered in the same peeling paint, showing the same impossible scenes. My footsteps echoed with sounds that weren't mine, and the elevator showed floors that didn't exist on the building directory. The final shape appeared on the wall opposite my bed, a mirror image of my room, but occupied by someone else. Another person sitting on another bed, staring at another wall covered in peeling paint. They were documenting the shapes too, taking photographs that showed only blank walls. When they looked up, I saw my own face, but with eyes that held knowledge I was only beginning to understand. The paint continues to peel, revealing new layers beneath. The shapes tell stories now, complete narratives that play out over days and weeks. I've become part of the pattern, another watching figure in someone else's nightmare. The apartment has memory, and I am becoming part of what it remembers. The previous tenant didn't leave suddenly. They simply became another shape on the wall, another story being told in peeling paint. The landlord knows this, has always known. The building is full of rooms like mine, each one documenting the dreams and fears of its occupants in layers of paint that remember everything. I still take photographs, but now they show the shapes too. My camera has learned to see what the walls want to show. The images reveal details that change each time I look at them. New faces in the burned backyard, new messages in the impossible languages, new versions of myself watching from corners that shouldn't exist. The paint peels in shapes I recognize because they are mine, drawn from memories I thought were private. But memory, like paint, has layers, and something in these walls knows how to read them all.